between which was the which was the dominant rabbinical interpretation, and which were the somewhat out there alternative interpretations. And of course, we will be shocked to hear that Ari prefers one of the out there alternative interpretations, as so do we all about most things in life. You're not a philosophy student unless you're a weirdo who's drawn to odd interpretations. But we're going to pick up with that again because there's a lot to say about Abraham and about Agamemnon and about the Greek concept versus the medieval concept of what is what is God related to man? What does God expect us to do? How are we supposed to, does he command us or does he give us advice? These are really, this really gets at some of the central theological differences between the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. So we're going to dive right into that. Let me start by posting the usual intro stuff. This is week 161. God help us all of this, just of the seminar about Millennia and Microcosm. We've been doing this longer because we did Mythos and Logos before that with Kenneth Smith. So I haven't been doing these for 6 years. Maybe David has. But at this point, we're wrapping up year 3 of Millennia and Microcosm. So that'll take us about halfway through the medieval section, which is interesting. Got another year and a couple months to go before we will feel like we have a grasp on the medievals. And so far in the first year, we spent a lot of effort, not so much talking just about the medieval worldview, but talking about the medieval worldview in contrast to the ancient worldview, right? Just trying to define them in terms of each other. And it's what's so helpful about this Hegelian existentialist interpretation of history, this idea that a new epoch pushes off against the older one. Some of the ideas of the older epoch are carried through intact, but other ideas are deliberately rejected. And the new epoch defines itself in terms of those rejections. I'm not one of those guys. So the modern era defines itself as the age of enlightenment. And we are not like the Dark Ages, which was the modern redefinition of the medieval epoch. So we know moderns are going to say the medieval era is the era of ignorance and brutality, and now we're all enlightened and brilliant, and we will fly through starships through space and shake hands with distant civilizations. I mean, this is we've got this really clear definition of modernity, which we'll get to in another year and a half. That is almost entirely based on not being medieval. So it's taken a while. Oh, go ahead.
The medievals were doing great, they reckon, because the ancient Greeks all go to hell.
Right. I mean, how do you negate the ancient world and all of its wonderful things? Well, you start by saying they're not saints, they're sinners. They're all going to hell. Each and every one of them burning in hell. Burn, burn, burn.
No. The virtuous get a nice spot in hell. The virtuous pagans.
Yes. They get one of the outer circles of hell, not the inner circle. That's saved for Judas, right? So anyway, we're at a point now where we're going to start shifting. We're going to keep going through these paragraphs of these chapters with Kenneth Smith. But starting next week, we're going to have a saint of the week, or spiritualist of the week, or nun of the week, friar of the week. We're going to have a little bit of pocket heresy every week that we'll introduce, and they're just little capsule summaries, just to point. I'm continuing Kenneth's project of pointing out at other writers and speakers. I'm augmenting this because I think in this section Kenneth focuses so much on how the medieval epoch is different from the ancient, and eventually he's going to talk about how different it is from the modern. That we don't get a lot of words from the medievals themselves. We get some. Oh, hang on. My wife is trying to come in and the door is locked. Give me just a moment here. There we go. All right. So fortunately, my wife is studying theology right now. And so, a constant stream of monks and nuns and spiritualists is giving me a lot of fodder to extend Kenneth's writing here with, quotes from Francis, Claire, just one person after another. We're going to get into that. I was this week going to start us off with Augustine, but I spent a couple hours reading Augustine, and I couldn't do it. I got to work my way up to bringing Augustine in because, unfortunately, along with the good stuff he says, he's also one of the standard bearers who helps to justify religious wars, tortured, converting people through torture, things like that. He's indispensable to the religious empire that's arising, and it makes him a tough read for me. I'm only sometimes going to be ready for that. I'm going to dive into Augustine instead with Hannah Arendt's thesis, her doctoral thesis. How many of you have heard of this? It's Love and Saint Augustine is the name of it, and this is from when she was studying under oh, why am I drawing a blank on her professor?
Heidegger?
Heidegger. Yes, Heidegger and I think Karl Jasper is the other one. And those two are a heavy influence. But the thing that's interesting about this thesis, even though in theory it's her first big philosophical work, is that she kept revising it throughout her entire life. And so every time she had a big philosophical epiphany, whether it was about totalitarianism and the Nazis, whether it was about the structure of the human mind and how we think, whether it was about authority and society and how those work, she'd go back and rework her thesis some more. In fact, she didn't publish it while she was alive. It had to be published posthumously by others. So on the one hand, it's a fascinating Hannah Arendt account because it's got an entire lifetime worth of philosophy woven into this framework that was written when she was young. But on the other hand, she's a modern looking back at a medieval. And we're talking about the medievals in this 2-year period of this seminar. And so it's interesting to see what she has to say about that, given her background and her areas of focus. So I hope to bring in some Augustine via Hannah Arendt in the next couple of weeks to kick off our Saints, Nuns, and Mystics of the Week addition to the medieval section. But for now, for those of you who are new, who haven't been here before, Millennia Microcosm is a book written by Kenneth Smith. The book has not yet been published, but all its contents have been. They were published serially as a column called End Times in the back of a magazine called The Comics Journal back in the 1998, 99, 2000 timeframe. And his goal in this is to get to where he helps us to overcome the fish in the water problem, that we don't know what water is because we're always swimming in it. We've never seen anything else. He says that's the problem for moderns. We've been inside the modern worldview our entire lives, and the whole world has been sucked into the modern worldview. And the result is we have no basis for contrast. We don't know what else human beings might think, how they could look at the world completely differently from the modern worldview. Moderns assert that there used to be other ways of looking at the world, but they were all backwards, primitive, baby steps. There's nothing interesting in them at all. Unless you just want to celebrate how great we are, you shouldn't even bother looking at those things. They're all just backwards and superstitious. But this is modernity interpreting itself and its history. And Kenneth says you can't trust modernity to do that. How would modernity know? Modernity is just marinating in its own juices. It doesn't know what those flavors are. So in this book, he takes us on an experiment walking through European history. He takes us through the ancient worldview in chapter 4. He takes us through the medieval worldview in chapters 5 through, 13 or 14, somewhere in there. And then the rest of the book will be about the modern worldview. And by teaching us how to look at the world from these 3 alien points of view and seeing their relationships and how they grew up from each other, his hope is that we won't be trapped in the modern worldview anymore. They'll be more like a tool we can pick up and use when it's useful and then put down when it's not useful and pick up some other perspective. And central to this is the idea that there are a lot of worldviews out there. He's only picking these 3 because they're very well documented. But after learning these 3, we should then be able to go out and discover other worldviews from other times and other places and learn to look at the world from multiple perspectives. That's the purpose of this book. And we're in the medieval section. We're in chapter 8. And we're in paragraph 4, and we're deep into paragraph 4. Chapter 8 is talking about theology, how the medieval theology works and how it's different from the ancient theology. And we're going to dive in with the sentences from paragraph 4 that we ended with last time. First, I'm gonna throw into the chat as I've started doing David Royal's nice summary, which he put on the page on Meetup. Unlike the deities of myth who embody distinct characters and domains, the Christian God emerges as an absolute judge, incorruptible, mysterious, and remote from human comprehension. Rooted in the Judaic tradition, this God is not bound by natural law or predictable bias, but may demand of believers even the unthinkable, as seen in Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. In this vision, faith requires readiness, discipline, and the refusal to let any gift become more important than the giver. And where we left off last time was sentences 5 and 6 from paragraph 4. I'm going to recite these again, and then we'll dig into the discussion because there's a lot of juicy stuff in here. So Kenneth wrote, the Judaic tradition, as Hans Jonas has encapsulated it, first emblazoned this notion of an unaccountable divinity who might at any time require even what is unthinkable of his believers. It is for this reason that ancient Judaism sustains the disciplines of fasting and ritual obedience to rules, because no one knows what he might be divinely called upon to do, but one must be spiritually ready. Abraham, father of the faith, was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, cherished beyond anything else. So last week, Ari walked us through several different interpretations. He said the dominant interpretation is more or less along the lines of what Kenneth Smith is saying here, that that as human beings, we can't pretend that we have a leash on God. We can't pretend that we always know for certain what God might or might not do or might not expect of us. He's God. He's infinite. We're finite. And it's hubris from this perspective to assume that we know God's limits of what God might want. And this is the focus that Ken is talking about. And Ari says that's the dominant rabbinical tradition. But Ari points out there is another tradition. And the other tradition says, actually, you can interpret what Abraham did not as a success, that he did what God wanted and that was the correct answer, and therefore he got his son back, but as a failure, that Abraham should have said no, that God would never ask you to do an immoral thing. So if it sounds like he's asking you to do an immoral thing, then you don't understand what God's saying, and that you have to push back and question. And that interpretation is very much in keeping with the rabbinical tradition, which, yes, he says, additionally, the gift is something you possess but never own. This includes all things, including your life and the lives of your children. Yes. But so this idea that we shouldn't do blind obedience, but that we should struggle with God's word and with scripture because we are prone to misunderstand. We're mortals. To be mortal is to be finite. To be finite is to have organs of understanding that are smaller than the infinite cosmos and the infinite God that we're supposedly trying to understand. And it means we're going to misunderstand a lot of things. We're going to make a lot of mistakes. And if we get too sure of ourselves and we try to turn our interpretation into an orthodoxy, we get into trouble. And we get into specifically the kind of trouble mortals get into when they're role-playing God, pretending to speak for God, pretending to know exactly what God wants. And so for this reason, it has been a tradition for thousands of years in Judaism that, if you get a rabbinical education, it's not like going to fundamentalist Bible school in America, where you just have to memorize all of the lines and memorize the correct interpretations and regurgitate them accurately and show that you can successfully say what you've been taught. But instead, it's about debate and discussion and arguing about the possibility, exploring the possible interpretations of the scripture, and coming down on the side of we are going to try to conclude what we think likely it means. But when we come down on that side, we come down lightly, like someone who recognizes that they're not God and they don't speak for God, and that what they're saying might not be accurate. And so this school of thought says that you can interpret the story of Abraham and his son, his grandson, as being that Abraham had the opportunity to be the founder of the new Jewish civilization, and he blew it. He blew it. And so he couldn't be the one. And his son wasn't the one either. It was what was it, Ari? It was his grandson who becomes the founder of the new Jewish civilization.
Yeah, Jacob.
Jacob.
I was writing something else. I figured it's just good to say it real fast. There's another mainstream component to this that adds a huge element to the equation. Essentially, that maybe really is less about Abraham than we think, and that Abraham maybe didn't do anything wrong, which is that Isaac was a fully grown man when this happened, and that Isaac does this under his free will. He willingly wants to, like, is known that he's being asked to sacrifice himself, and that his father is supposed. This is more like Abraham letting his son be the sacrifice if his son is to do it, which is an interesting. It's not like he's a little kid. He's like a, I don't know, like a 36 or some fully grown adult, what we would call at least, that is willingly taking this place as the animal to be sacrificed.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, and that just illustrates it further. There's a third interpretation, and this is typical of the rabbinical tradition, that you wrestle with these ideas and you collect these alternatives and you think about them. You might spend the rest of your life thinking about them. Your people might develop a literature about this that goes on for thousands of years, where you discuss all these alternatives, and that this is very much in opposition to the medieval concept. The central medieval imperial concept is that there's one correct interpretation, and everybody who deviates from that is some kind of heretic. You have to correct the heretics and try to bring them back into the fold. And if they won't go, you have to burn them or torture them. You hope that you can change their mind so that you can save their soul from an eternity of torment. There is this one way is the right way. There can be only one, and we must exterminate all alternatives. Thrust to the medieval interpretation of this story that's not present in the Jewish interpretation of the story. The Jewish interpretation of the story is that we're human beings and we make mistakes and we don't always understand things. There's a lot to chew on here, and we shouldn't be so quick to try to come down and say this is the one true answer. This is one of the huge differences between the ancient perspective and the medieval perspective. And it's one of those things that when we say a phrase, which Jews almost never say, but Christians like to say a lot, we say Judeo-Christian. We're sort of lumping the Jews in with the Christians. And we think we're honoring them by saying, at least they have the right idea, even if we're more right than they are. That's what the Christians mean by Judeo-Christian. They're kind of part of our big tent, but we pat them on the head because they didn't understand how important Jesus was. And in this, they're trying to equate Judaism and Christianity and say that Christianity is Judaism plus Jesus. And otherwise they're in lockstep. And when we say this, we're making, when Christians say this, we're making a huge blunder, because the Jews interpret their own scripture radically different than the Christians interpret it. Right? It's even in the name, Torah versus Old Testament, the Old Testament versus the New Testament. There is this sense of that's the old stuff, and a lot of it's been superseded by Jesus. And but feel free to dig around in there. But when you dig around in there, know that that is absolutely the word of God, and it's all absolutely correct, and we all know exactly what it means. This is this fundamentalist medieval interpretation of the Jewish holy books when they're converted into an Old Testament. The term Judeo-Christian is designed to erase the enormous differences between the ancient Jewish interpretation and the medieval Christian interpretation. And it does the same kind of disservice to our capacity to understand what's at stake as Greco-Roman. We pretend that the Romans are pretty much the same as the Greeks. Whereas, as Kenneth says, the Greeks are sort of the high point of the ancient civilization, and the Romans are sort of the mafia empire of ancient civilization. The Roman approach to philosophy is, I'm going to get me one of them smart guys. I'll have him as a decoration around my house to make me look good. But how smart is he really, since he's a slave and I'm the guy in charge? This is the Roman approach to philosophy. We got to dress up the things that we were going to do anyway and make them look good. The Greco-Roman is a hideous term, just like Judeo-Christian is a hideous term. And part of what, if we don't take anything else away from this seminar, we want to take away the idea that you can't just buy into these terms, because they are obscuring what should never be made obscure. They're covering up what needs to be talked about, these incredibly important differences. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I want to disagree. I have another perspective of it. The term Judeo-Christian does not imply erasure, it implies originality. And as a Christian, we see Christianity originated from the Judaic faith. And we have different takes on things. The Christianity is primarily in the New Testament, but there's some Old Testament stories and parables that we honor, right? But it's not an erasure. It's not to say, well, Judaism was not relevant. It's to say, this is where we're coming from. It implies origin. That's the way I learned it.
Yes.
It's just
Well,
another opinion.
It's good. It's good to share that. And you know, part of what's interesting about all this is, you know, modern Christians are writing from a very different perspective than medieval Christians, right? That's because we're writing from the modern worldview, which interprets all of these things very differently. The Reformation, what Martin Luther kicked off with the Reformation, it caused an explosion of alternative interpretations that has followed since then. And that explosion, in some ways, has a rabbinical quality to it. That idea that, you know, Calvinists might interpret the story of Abraham one way, and Lutherans might interpret it another way, and Baptists a third way. And so there could be many possible interpretations. And, you know, we're no longer going to set out on the project to exterminate all except the one we believe in. And what happens with modern Christians when they allow this diversity of sects in Christianity is in many ways the antithesis of medieval Christianity. And so what you mean by Judeo-Christian is entirely different, I agree, from what a medieval might have meant by Judeo-Christian, or what a politician, God help us, means.
And they don't have no idea.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting how we, you know, these things become tug of wars, you know, about you know, I mean, you see this split to the present day. There are still sects of Christianity that are all about that rabbinical approach of let us have many flowers blooming, let us have lots of different interpretations, let's explore spirituality and God, and it's good that we do that. And there are many people in the modern world who take that interpretation, but you still get some what I might think of as medieval throwbacks who say we have the only one true right interpretation, and our job is to persuade everybody else to see things our way. And sometimes this gets expressed in a missionary impulse, sending out lots and lots of missionaries to try to make sure that other countries don't convert to the wrong type of Christianity, they only convert to our type. And sometimes you see this in struggles and debates between different Christian sects. The non-interfaith, the non-ecumenical versions, you know, still say I've got the right way and your way is the wrong way. And when they say that, they're echoing the medieval perspective, just that there's one correct interpretation. And what a coincidence! It's the one I have. So yeah, you're right. I was oversimplifying. So Judeo-Christian, right? So what we're looking at here is this question, but I wanted to play with this concept of what if there was an interpretation that said that Abraham chose incorrectly, right? I wanted to riff on that a little bit because there's several points of comparison that are important here, and one of them is the Hopi Navajo tradition. Now, Hopi and Navajo have two separate religions. They're two separate, not just indigenous nations in North America, but really different races. They have different bloodlines. They're very far apart linguistically, and yet they live side by side. Their homes are right next to each other. And the Navajo story is that the Hopi were there when the Navajo arrived. The Hopi got there first, and that the Navajo moved in around them. But what's interesting is despite the fact that their religions came from different places, their languages came from different places, they have this same idea, which is that this is not the first world. There have been worlds before this. And the ancestors of the Hopi people and the ancestors of the Navajo people, before they came here to this world, they were in the previous world. And before that, an even older world. Before that, an even older world. And I forget which one is which. One of them says that this is the fourth world, and one of them says it's the fifth world. I always forget which one is which. But the general framework of this idea is that our ancestors didn't know everything about how to live. and they made blunders, terrible, terrible blunders. And those blunders were so bad that in some cases, the inhabitants of those earlier worlds cast out our ancestors. They said, get out. We can't live with you. You're too awful. You have done a thing you should never have done. You have to leave. So sometimes they were banished from these earlier worlds. But sometimes they did debacles so bad they destroyed the earlier worlds. It may be by flood, maybe by ice, maybe they wrecked it. They wrecked the whole world and had to flee because they basically committed ecocide. So whether it's one or the other, they have this story of a succession of flights from one world to the next, and a story about how they got from the previous world to the next world. And in each case, when they get to the new world, their people, somebody among their people stands up and says, this is what we've done wrong. This is why things went badly. And if we want to be a going concern as a people, we can't do that anymore. We ruined the old world, or we offended the old world and we had to leave. If we don't want to get cast out of this new world, we have to change our culture. We have to upgrade it to include these new lessons that we never had before. And each world that they move to, one after another, they add a new layer of culture and lessons learned and self-criticism. Their ancestors are not perfect, pure, saints who did everything right, and we just have parades for them and celebrate all the time. The end, cheerleading. But instead, the culture criticism is right at the center of their culture, and it's at the center of their conception of their own history, that they had to go through multiple periods of blunders, culture criticism, and anthropoculture, cultivating a new, improved culture for the people. In the case of the Navajo, and I know this, I've studied the Hopi and I've studied the Navajo, but it's been years since I read the books on the Hopi. Whereas the Navajo books I go back to regularly. So this one I can speak with not any authority, but a little more clarity. In the old world, first man and first woman made a number of blunders, and they had to flee that world to this world. And in this world, it's Changing Woman who becomes the culture bearer for the Navajo people. And Changing Woman is the one who teaches the lessons about there are things in life that you can do, but you should not do. Those things are nayeh, or evil. And evil things, nayeh things, are not things that you destroy, like the medieval ideal, as good has to destroy evil, but rather they're things to be used sparingly, like medicine, right? Medicine is not food. Aspirin could save your life, but if you try to treat aspirin like a meal, you'll kill yourself. You have to know the difference between what is the meat and potatoes of life on the one hand, and what is the medicine of life on the other. And Changing Woman sets up this way of life for the Navajo in which all of the world is separated into hojon, which is the good stuff you can harmonize with, and you should have as part of your life every day, all the time, and nayeh, which is the dangerous stuff, the stuff that can be used for protection, for medicine, but it has to be used sparingly and precisely, just like anesthesia. Sharon, her career she's been a dispenser of anesthesia, and she knows that you don't treat anesthesia like oxygen. You don't just go around all day huffing on anesthesia. It's not the way it works. It's a medicine, not a food. It has to be used sparingly and precisely and according to carefully calibrated ritual. And this is what the Navajo believe about nayeh. All the nayeh stuff, you don't destroy it, but you keep it isolated, and you watch for the times in your life when it calls for anesthesia. And when the time calls for anesthesia, you go through the prescribed practices and procedures for how to dispense the anesthesia and how long to do it and when to stop doing it. And you stop doing it and you go back to your regular life after the crisis is over. This is how they see nayeh. And in that group, they put violence. The Navajo say, violence is evil. And that doesn't mean there should never be violence, but it means there should not usually be violence. When times call for violence, you do a ritual, you do a sacred rite to say, we all recognize that this is one of those terrible times that calls for violence. And we're going to use it carefully and responsibly we're just going to be dispensed, titrated according to the medicine, that's called for in this situation. And when we're done and the situation has been resolved, we do another ritual, which is We recognized that we did a terrible thing. We had to do it for protection. This was the time that called for it, but now it's over. And if we don't put it away, we will wreck our lives and our culture, like our ancestors did the world before. So we're going to put that back away again and say, this is not part of the normal Navajo beauty way. It goes back on a shelf. We do the ritual. We ask for forgiveness for the wrongs that we did. We acknowledge that we did wrongs, right? It's wrong to use these things. It may be the only way to get through it, but we had to be careful. It's just like, opiates in a hospital. Everybody keeps track of how much is used. You don't pretend it's normal to be dishing out opiates. You have to carefully track when you used it and how you used it and when you're done using it, and you put it away. So what's interesting to me about this is that this is two different cultures, radically different cultures, the Hopi and the Navajo, that share in common this interpretation that Ari shared with us last week about that one of the purposes of an epic is not to celebrate our people and say how great we are. That's what Virgil did for the Romans with the Aeneid. Isn't this fantastic? Look at us. We're descended from Aeneas, survivor of Troy. Man, it's good to be Roman. And that is not what the Iliad and the Odyssey were doing. The Iliad and the Odyssey were saying, wow, our best and brightest, our most heroic people, they blundered on a huge scale and they wrecked civilization. And we need to do better than that. We cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. We want a new generation of culture that learns, that incorporates those lessons. And we don't want to cover up those mistakes because then we'll make them again. We want to teach those mistakes to every Greek child, free or slave. Everybody needs to hear the stories about how you can be a person full of virtue and still screw up on a massive scale, and try to get us to understand how not to do that again. You see what I'm kind of focusing on here? This idea of an epic, and this is not a modern idea. This is a classical idea, or maybe an indigenous idea. The idea of an epic as being the guide to the lessons learned, the big important lessons that we learned, the price that we paid to learn them, and how we are going to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes again. I have, another example that's interesting to me is on this same theme is Thucydides. And in the intro to his history of the Peloponnesian War, he makes this fascinating contention, which is a very non-Greek thing to do. This particular argument is just shot. If the Greeks were medievals, this would be considered blasphemy. He basically says that the Peloponnesian War is the most important war that ever happened in Greek history. Why is that shocking? Because the Greeks say the Trojan War is the most important war that ever happened in history. And it's so important, we're going to teach every single Greek the history of the Trojan War. And we're going to repeat it. Every 4 years, we're going to recite the whole damn cycle of epics from beginning to end over the course of the Olympian Games. And we're going to do that because we have to make sure nobody ever forgets how important this war was and the things that we did, the mistakes we made that we don't want to repeat. The challenge we have as a people to stop quarreling with each other, to try to learn how to be a people that can hold together. For Thucydides to come out and say, yeah, I mean, I was raised that way. We were all raised that way. We all think that way. And yet, I think this war between Athens and Sparta is a bigger deal than the Trojan War. The level of how shocking that would be to his audience is difficult to convey to a modern. I actually don't know what the equivalent would be. Maybe if somebody were to say, yeah, Jesus was pretty cool, but what about this other guy? I think he's more important. That might be shocking to a Christian at that same level. It's like, what is the foundation of your society? Now let's question that. So why would he say this? He's the idea that the Greeks are teaching the Trojan War over and over and over is that they believe it won't be possible to have a Greek people in the future unless we learn those lessons. That what we did was such a disaster, and it's a disaster that's writ deep into our character, our national character as a people, that if we don't watch ourselves, we're going to repeat those mistakes. That was the basis for making the Trojan War the teaching lesson for all of the Greeks. And What Thucydides is saying is that the scale of the disaster that's happening in the Peloponnesian War goes even deeper into the Greek psyche than the Trojan War does. You know, he writes it as a critique of the character of Athens and Sparta and their allies. And how could Athens have fallen from its earlier glory down to the point where it can make these kinds of blunders? And it can make the blunders not only in a way that every Greek should see coming, and every Athenian should see coming, but even when that fact itself is pointed out to the Athenians during the war by the Spartan generals, the Athenians still can't hear it. Don't you see the way that you are reproducing the same mistakes that we spent our whole lives learning not to make? And the Athenian response comes out to nuh-uh. which you know, Thucydides is baffled by. What is happening in the minds of the Athenians that they can look right at the obvious evidence of their blunder and not feel even the slightest nervousness or shame or anything? You know, they're at the point where they're being lectured not only by Sparta, they're being lectured by small city-states who are saying, wow, have you noticed lately that, you know, you were like completely out of control and behaving badly? And again, the Athenian response is, nuh-uh. We're the best and the brightest. You can't tell us what to do. We're the winners, and winners win. You know, so he's basically saying, what Thucydides is saying in the history by retelling this history and arguing that it should be central, he's continuing that Greek idea that for there to be a Greek people, there has to be a Greek epic that shows in the clearest possible terms what a major challenge the Greeks are facing, what a characterological flaw they have that they have to learn to overcome. And if they don't overcome that flaw, we're doomed. The Hellenes are doomed. There won't be Greeks anymore. This is what he's saying. This is the argument that he's making. And when he makes this argument, he's recapitulating this idea that the Hopi have and that the Navajo have, and that maybe, as Ari says, maybe this was part of the Jewish interpretation way back when about Abraham as well. That part of the purpose of an epic is as a warning. It's to warn about the things. It's like there are other things you can forget, but this thing, if you forget this thing, you are going to be so sorry. Like in my case, growing up in an alcoholic family, the thing I can never forget is that I've got the alcoholic gene, right? Other people don't have to think about that, but I can't forget about it, because if I ever, of all the mistakes I can make and recover from in life, that's the one, if I make it, I probably won't ever recover from. What is it that's in your character that is dependent and addictive and has enormous blind spots? If you know where that is, and you make that a centerpiece of your culture and say, let us never forget this terrible addiction that we suffered, this blind spot that we have, this will to self-destruction. Because if we want to survive, we have to not touch the third rail. That's the third rail. If you touch it, you get electrocuted. Don't touch that thing. You got to tell everybody who comes down here into the subway, that's the third rail. Don't touch it. And if an epic doesn't do that, then it's not an epic. And do you even have a culture? If you're not warning people away from the attractive, shiny things that lead us to destroy our own civilizations, then what the hell is it? It's not an epic. It's something else. No comment on Charlie Kirk. So anyway, all of this I think is bound up with these sentences that he's quoting here when he's talking about this Judaic tradition. And we look at the way that the Jewish tradition interprets Abraham and Isaac in a number of different ways. It's part of this question of what is to be a true myth, to be a true epic, to have a real culture. You have to be willing to grapple with your flaws and problems, and not just willing occasionally in a dark place and then forget about it. It has to be made front and center. What are the dangerous things that we have to manage? You know, if I could convey anything about the Greeks that's really hard to get across to moderns, it's the way that they never just talk about the positive. They always talk about the negative too. with at least as much interest. For every term that they have to talk about the things you should do, they'll have a corresponding term for the things you shouldn't do. And it'll be another precise technical term. All right. So that's it for those sentences. That was, I don't know if people have questions, comments, or concerns about that before we move on, but yeah, Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
There's something interesting that I noted. You're talking about the Judeo-Christian epic. And you know, the 13th century, or 13th or 14th, correct? Took them a long time to get it done. I think I have my time frame right. But one of the things during the facade, they have two statues, which when the cathedral was destroyed, they redid it. And these statues speak about the early Christians and their contempt for Judaism. The first statue is called Synagoga, and I heard this in a lecture, which is representing Judaism. She is shown as defeated, blindfolded with a snake, punched over. And then right next to her, you have Ecclesia. And I've been to the Notre Dame Cathedral. As you walk in there, you see the two of them. But if you really don't know the significance, while Ecclesia represents the victorious Catholic Church. And from that period in time, I guess this was reflective of the persecution of the Jews. So when you talk about the Judeo-Christian epic, the Christians didn't respect the Jews at this time. At that time, it's interesting to me that they enshrined it in this permanent structure.
Yes. Yes. Yeah,
That's what I have to say.
What you're pointing out is incredibly important. I mean, my God, anti-Semitism in the medieval period is it's just the worst. It's just so awful. And the history of it, we're going to obviously talk about over and over over the course of the next year and a half. But a lot of it comes from there was that traumatic stage in the first century of Christianity where Rome conquers Judea, right? And it's a brutal slaughter. I mean, it is just, they send in the legions and they just beat the crap out of the Jewish people. And Christianity is arising within this very same context. And so you can see when you compare Mark and Matthew and Luke, you can see sort of a tug of war for Christian identity between, are we Jews or are we not Jews? Do we have to follow Jewish law because Christianity is a Jewish sect? Or do we set aside Jewish law because we're some new religion that has split off from the Jews? And they're fighting about it for like a century. The early Christians can't make up their minds. They're struggling with this question. But one of the things that ultimately decides it for them is this idea that the Jews keep having revolutionaries who are fighting back against the Romans, and the Romans keep coming in and just committing atrocity after atrocity against the Jews in order to try to tame them and make them good Roman citizens. And the Christians ultimately decide it's better for the survival of Christianity to separate themselves from the Jews and say, oh, those are the violent revolutionaries over there. We're just the peaceful, we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We pay our taxes, we follow the laws. We're good Roman citizens. Please don't, anytime you come over here to persecute Jews, don't persecute us. And this shift in identity happens, between like 50 and 150 AD, until by 150 AD, Christianity has moved from being a largely Jewish religion to being a very anti-Jewish religion, in which it's starting to collect canonical and extra-canonical books that have enormously negative things to say about the Jews, and that the Jews had it coming and they deserve to be beaten up by the Romans, and they're not like us. There's just a huge amount of negation. And now we're looking at Hegel and his dialectic, right? There's a huge amount of negation and saying we're as far away from Jews as we can get. And what you see in the statues at that cathedral is the continuation of that tradition that says that for a long time Christians were very concerned with emphasizing how not Jewish they are. It became central to the medieval Christian identity. And you see it in Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, in which he basically shows the Jews in the worst, most vindictive, nasty possible light he can in order to justify, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. Because Mel Gibson hates Jews with a flaming passion. He's from the sect within the Catholic Church. There is a sect that really, really hates the Jews, and he's part of that group. Opus Dei and the like. They embrace what those statues represent to this day. And so he makes a film, 2000, it's been 2,000 years, and he's still making a film that tries to get you to walk out of the theater enraged at the Jews, trying to, feeling certain that the Jews murdered Jesus and it's their fault. And then he turns you loose to see what you'll do in the world, armed with those feelings. And boy, it's not been a great time since then. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. You're still on mute, though.
Sorry about that. Yeah. I wanted to bring up something. It's a little, I don't think it's off topic, but it's about the Jewish sort of perspective within the medieval period. And if that's okay, it's essentially an idea that I don't think, let alone Christians or the secular world, but I don't think most Jews even realize it's a certain amount of water that we're in, and it has to do with what happened with what were the effects of I don't know, you call them pogroms, because that's more of like a later Russian Ukrainian thing, but it was this idea of a version of the Holocaust that happened with the Crusades, that essentially as the Christians were rallying towards the infidels in Jerusalem, they thought, hey, let's take care of all the infidels along the way. And there was essentially, what I'm going to say here is there was a huge death of Jewish culture that may not have wiped out them as a people, but essentially their scholars and their writings were almost entirely lost. And I'm going to say this through actually the work of my mother. Her pen name is Maggie Anton. She's obviously, in real life, she's Margaret Parkhurst. That's my mom's name. But she's what called is a Rashi scholar. And Rashi, like, maybe you may have never heard of him, but he is the voice in the medieval period that allows the moderns and all of the medievals, but basically at that point, he's the only voice that does a translation exercise for what we know in modern days as the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. And essentially these works, there's this oral tradition and this long, rich literature of scholarly stuff. And essentially where he was from in Worms, which is like in Germany area, that was completely wiped out by the Crusades. And that if it weren't for him alone, and he went to France in a place called Troyes, where he was safe harbor, so to speak, where Jews were really doing well with trade there and really benefiting France at that point for their festivals and whatnot, that the Jews were thriving there. He came from Worms, and he, for whatever reason, he had to go back to France to deal with family issues, because he's actually famous in the Jewish world for having a vineyard, and he had to tend his farm. There's actually a lot of wines that are Rashi wines these days. But to make a long story short, he left, and he was the only scholar from there that survived. And if you read, in a modern sense, if you read the commentaries on the Jewish oral tradition, he's the only one. He's the only voice we have. And essentially, we learn this when we learn in our biblical ways, that if it weren't for him surviving, we wouldn't know how to read this stuff anymore. We would have no, what's called a Masorah. We'd have no tradition for how to interpret these scholarly works. It would have been entirely lost. And this is the idea that there were thousands of these scholars in the Germanic area that were completely wiped out, along with all of their writings. Not to say, it's almost heretical to say what I'm going to say, is not to say the downplay the how horrible the Holocaust was, but as a culture, this genocide in the medieval era was much, much worse for the Jewish people
than the Holocaust. As individuals, yes, 6 million individuals died in the Holocaust. It was horrible. Not saying anything of that. But as a culture, the information was surviving in a lot of different places, the United States, whatever, in the Middle East, wherever it is, lots of places in the world, there were people who could carry on through tradition. But at this point in the medieval era, it was entirely wiped out. And it's actually really, really nice to put this like you're describing. This is the mission, like you're saying, of the medieval era to create a complete genocide of all of these other ways of religion. This is their goal, to wipe out all of the information and all of the people entirely. And they nearly succeeded, except for this one guy, Rashi, and then his grandsons later. We use them exclusively to interpret these texts that are studied by every, I don't know, religious Jew around the world. And so he is the only voice that survived. And it's really interesting to note that because of this genocide that was from the medieval era, it transformed the Jewish people at this point from almost their own ancient to some sort of medieval perspective, that it was because of Rashi and then also the Rambam. But the Rambam doesn't do any of this stuff on the mission. He just tells you what it is. He does the very Christian, almost Aristotelian style of just lays out a system and tells you the protocols. They just tell you what's what. They just tell you what to do. And they argue essentially because people no longer have a rich tradition of discussion and a dialectic, which is the older period called the Gaonic period, where there was like things like distance yourself from evil and attach yourself to good, which actually sounds a lot like Sofer Sune. That's that Gaonic period was totally lost because all of these wise scholars were gone, and people's essentially level of ability to engage in the material is so low that you need to have this more childish approach. It's like, just do this, just do that, don't do this, don't do that, and a whole bunch of protocols. And this mindset of rules to follow in a prescribed mechanism rather than a dialectic is exactly what changes in the Jewish medieval era. It goes from this dialectic approach to this dogmatic approach. And it's 100%, at least my mom, and it's convinced me very much, it argues specifically it's because they wiped out this genocide of the Jewish people in the Crusade era, of wiping out every village, every place that they went along the way. They were almost entirely successful. And so there was this huge loss of scholarship, and therefore the people in general were at such a low ability to engage in the material. It's almost like, which I think you described before, almost like the way that Latin died, went from a gold into a silver. It's like that was forced upon them because they were all destroyed, and all their books, all their scrolls, everything, like all of that was really gone. So I wanted to add that to this whole thing that Kenneth is probably not really aware of, but he's actually hinting at very nicely in other things, and it matches up very well. There's this shift of this medieval period that also happens to the Jewish people, and for better or for worse, why it happened, but it's a similar thing, that the times changed and they lost their dialectic approach, and it follows a very similar naturality to just go to certain types of protocols of what to do, and a lot less of like why you do this. It's almost like a lot more of logos, a lot less of mythos, because the mythos were lost as opposed to they were rejected. At least that's the way I understand it.
Yeah, this is something the Greeks warn about. It's that for a polis to have a healthy culture, there has to be competition among a number of ideas. And if you ever get to the point where one set of ideas dominates from a single person, the Greeks warn that your culture is collapsing, because without the debate and the discussion, you have no dialectic. It's just too hard for a single person to try to represent dozens of different perspectives. I mean, this is one of the reasons that Donald and I and David and others like Kenneth Smith, is he does have the gift of being able to put on and take off hats from different philosophers and simulate arguments between them. But most of us can't do that. It's hard enough just to keep track of your own perspective, let alone to try to be the culture bearer of dozens of other perspectives. And so something happens like the medieval period with its genocide against Jewish culture in Europe. And of course, you're going to see this just tremendous impact that it has. It's just impossible to maintain the dialectic after that. It took decades of studying medieval history before I finally clicked in realizing that the key to understanding kind of the medieval power structure was genocide. Proud genocide, happy genocide, just like saying flat out, this is why we're here, is Our mission on earth is to exterminate all their religions. And we're going to be soldiers of Christ, and we're going to go out and do that. And it's the cross or the sword, but one way or another, your religion has to go. This idea that genocide it's not a furtive thing, it's not a criminal thing, it's not a people doing it when nobody's looking. It's literally the entire point. It's the whole promise of the medieval epoch from the perspective of the power structure, not from the perspective of people like Francis and Clare and these on, but from the perspective of these popes and these generals and kings. This is the point. This is what it's for. And when they see an opportunity, like the Crusades moving across Europe on its way to the Middle East, and it's like, hey, look, this village is full of Jews. Of course they're going to kill them all. Of course they are. It's what the whole point is. We have to get rid of all these people. The fact that this wasn't really what we were doing here, this mindset helps to explain why when in the next couple of months we're going to start getting into the history of the Crusades. And one of the things that we're going to see is it's a minority of Crusades where all the soldiers ended up where they were supposed to go. At least half the time they diverted off somewhere else, and they were taking out Jews. They were sacking Constantinople. They were selling children into slavery. They were attacking the Albigensians in France. And you'd think, well, how is it that they can't stay on focus? How is it that Europe fires this arrow from its bow and it misses the target half the time? And the answer is it didn't miss the target. The target is everybody who doesn't conform. Every variant religion. Not just attacking, the Muslims in the Middle East, but are there Jews? Are there Christians who aren't Christian enough? I mean, anybody is fair game. The point is this purification, and it's hard to stay focused on anything when you're surrounded by all the heresy and blasphemy, and it's all got to go. We stamp it all out. So I'm sharing a link here. There's a author, Veronica Chanos, wrote a book of short stories called Burning Girls and Other Stories. And I'm in a science fiction fantasy book club, and we did this one last year. And it's one of our favorite short story collections. She's just so creative. She does urban fantasy, magical realism type stuff, where she sets it in history, but then introduces fantasy elements. And so she has, encounters between young Jewish women and the Baba Yaga, or what Ari was just talking about. She takes a traditional medieval story about the evil Jew who wrecked the town and they all had to kill him. And yay, he's victorious. Our town can now live in peace because we killed the evil Jew. And she turns that into a story about from the Jew's perspective where he wasn't evil at all. And, it's just a bunch of anti-Semitic people who their ideology made them, unable to distinguish good people from bad people. They see somebody who's not exactly the right kind of Christian. They're like, well, obviously they have to die. It's quite an interesting collection of stories, and it culminates in for those of you who know your labor history in the United States, it culminates in the story of the Triangle Shirt Factory that caught fire in was it New Jersey or New York? And you guys know about this? All the garment workers, their working conditions were so awful that they were forced to stay in. They couldn't take bathroom breaks or anything else. The doors were locked, and so when a fire broke out, none of them could escape. They all burned to death. This is actual U.S. history, and it changed
That
labor
was
laws.
only a few years ago, wasn't it? Wasn't it within the last 5 years or something?
Early 20th century.
But there was something.
It happens again later, yes, but the
like
famous
within the last
incident.
10 years or something. Yeah.
The famous incident is early 20th century. And so she turns that into a story of magical realism. So if you like that sort of thing, this is a great collection. And it's got that bit that Ari was talking about. There's a story in a medieval folk tale, which she says, by the way, it's in the Brothers Grimm collection, Grimm's fairy tales. It's not all, Snow White and Hansel and Gretel. It also has, the evil Jew, and, we have to kill the evil Jew so that we can all be free. And she's like, we need to talk about this, that this is part of our storytelling tradition and what we're raising our kids on. And what does that do to the relationships between people of different religions? Anyway, Ginny, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm just, my question is this: what is it about Jewish religion and people that people wanted to destroy them? But historically, I mean, you don't hear about that about Buddhists. I mean, people are trying to kill off all the Buddhists, or, I mean, is that because Jewish people were religious but never not militant to have a strong military to block, these violence against them? I don't understand that. Am I wrong? I mean, do I have it all wrong? I don't.
Well, the history is extraordinarily complicated, but in a nutshell, it goes hand in hand with the idea that Europe went through 1,000 years where the worldview was genocidal. So who's nearby? If you've got to convert or kill all the bad guys, who's with you in Europe? Well, Jews are with you in Europe. They're right there. They're at hand. So if you have a genocidal culture, it's your neighbors that are going to suffer the most. The ability of Christians to kill Muslims was limited by the fact that they had to get on horseback and travel all the way across Europe to go reach the Muslims. And they did an enormous amount of damage, but they really had to travel to get there. Whereas the amount of damage that they were able to do to Constantinople and to Jews and to, Albigensians, people who were actually in Europe at the time, it made them easy targets. It's the low-hanging fruit of genocide is the neighbor nearby who's different from you. And that's a big part of why the Jews suffered so much, is they were too easy to reach for 1,000 years. Sharon wants to add something.
I just want to add a comment. That's the entire story of the Old Testament, though. And I guess Ari could comment on this. The Jews were always being persecuted and killed and their lands taken from them. That's the entire story of the Old Testament, predominantly.
Yeah, it's certainly a recurring theme. Certainly a recurring theme. But in addition to that, that you've got a genocidal culture and the Jews are handy. On top of that, you have this problem that early Christianity it makes its peace with the Roman Empire by siding with the Romans against the Jews. And it works it into its history and theology. It retells its own history as the Jews killed Jesus. We would still have Jesus if it weren't for the Jews. The Jews are God killers. And that's, I mean, by 150, that's what they're saying. There's books floating around that didn't make it into the canon, but that were more popular than many of the books that did make it into the canon. That everybody's reading them, that are saying this over and over, get the Jews, get them. It's their fault God is dead. I mean, this is the ferment that's happening in early Christianity. So it's not a surprise that as Christianity rises to power and takes over the imperial military apparatus of the Roman Empire, it then uses that power against the Jews more than anybody else. It's this history of resentment. And of course, it's all based on bullshit. I mean, the Jews didn't kill Jesus. That's, this is not the story of the Old Testament. You have to be pretty theologically backward to interpret it that way. Jesus has a lot of things to say against a lot of the power structures. He's the
Although what's happening with Israel and Palestine, is that kind of backwards than the way things have been happening throughout history? I'm just wondering. Could we see it that way? What's happening, with Palestinians by Israelis?
Oh God. I mean, it gets as complicated as Christians versus Jews is. What's happening in Israel today is like 10 times more complicated as far as why it's happening. Yeah, and I'm not gonna dive into that as a side issue. It would take at least 3 hours or maybe 3 years to really do justice to that topic. I'm just gonna put it on a shelf for now. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
There's a thesis that the Middle Ages were especially genocidal, or at least in certain cultures. I'm going to be the antithesis. I hear this all the time. It's like claiming that the Europeans are somehow particularly genocidal. I would say genocide is part and parcel of every character structure. It's buried there in every person, and it's always wanting to get out. That's my antithesis of this whole idea that it's only special times and it's only special peoples that do genocide. I doubt it very much. For example, there's a lot of complaints about, Israel's treatment of of Gaza, but Gaza's ruled by a minority whose plans are the extermination of Israel, and that never changes. Nothing. That's the one agenda that never changes, no matter what. So yeah, when you're saying, well, genocide is the role of the unenlightened, I'd say look for the genocidal attitudes amongst the enlightened. Charlie Kirk's a beautiful example. It's here today with you.
Yes.
Genocide will be with you until the end of the world as as an urge of the human character.
Yes. I agree with what you're saying. And I'm not, and what it tells me is that I haven't adequately explained what I mean when I say the medieval era is genocide in a special way. I don't mean nobody had genocide before them or after them. What I mean is when we do genocide now, we spend all our time saying it's not genocide. Oh no, we don't commit genocide. We're just defending ourselves. We would never commit genocide because genocide is wrong. That's the modern take. The medieval take is no, genocide is great. Genocide is great, and we're going to do it. We're going to bring about the brotherhood of man over the earth through genocide. That they didn't have the word, but they basically, in every way they could, came out and said, "This is what we're about. We're totally about converting or killing everybody." And nobody normally says that. That is a really unusual thing to do. Normally, people say, "I'm all about peace and goodness." And now, if you force me, I suppose I have to defend myself, right? This is normally how people engage in genocide. Is
We
they
have
say,
some quotes for that, do we?
"Oh, there's so many quotes." I mean, just about every 20th century genocidal person is on the record saying they're not genocidal. It's just that's what they do. It's remarkable. Uh, there are, and you've actually pointed out one of the exceptions, which is when the Romans salt the earth of Carthage. It's an astonishing act. It's like normally, yeah, these guys are violent and stuff, but they aren't normally like trying to kill the earth underneath them so that nothing ever grows again. That's like, even for the ancients, that's like
Well,
a
there was Corinth almost in the same year.
Corinth.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
wiped out.
Yes.
And this was very different from the attitude of the Romans, say about 200 BC in the Second Punic War.
Yes.
Then 50 years later, they were into absolute destructions.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Something changed.
Something changed.
You can even see in the attitude towards Hannibal. It was the slightly later generation that chased him down, and some of the older generation in the Senate will say, oh, why are you bothering chasing down this old man?
Yes.
No, we have to get him.
Right. Something's clicked.
I mean,
Something.
Scipio, according to the story, Scipio meets Hannibal and has a chivalric sort of discussion with him. They'd been both the enemy commanders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, you know, he meets him in Greece somewhere and has a discussion about the old days.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, well, that's my antithesis anyway. Thank you.
No, I'm glad you brought it up. And it's there is something. I mean, genocide goes hand in hand with abstraction, with noesis, with thinking about people in categories instead of, the concrete lived experience of each person.
With Hegelian absolute idea.
Yes. Yes. The not the concrete universal, but the abstract universal. His Verstand says that's the realm that lends itself to genocide. Because then instead of Stephen and Joe and Phineas and Donald and everybody else on this call as individuals, I can just start using broad abstractions. Those fucking philosophers. they have to go. You know they're trouble. They're always like that. You know, and Noesis loves to think that way because it feels powerful to summarize vast swaths of the world with a few sentences. There's
Donald's Edict 301.
there's an addictive quality to the ability to make these prognostications on broad swaths, but it all depends upon not dealing with the real person, because real people are all weird and funny and different and interesting. You know, everybody's peculiar, and the lived experience, makes it doesn't fit the abstraction. This is what Hegel warns us of. It's too abstract.
Well, this is actually an aspect of Christianity, properly practiced, is that it accepts the weirdness of all the different people.
Yes.
Because every person is valuable.
Yes.
God created them in a way, so their weirdness is part of God's creation.
Exactly. I mean, there's Jesus hanging out with lepers and prostitutes and pissing off all the people who have everyone categorized into untouchables and good people. And he's like, no, you have to deal with each person as they are. Each person is different. Each person has something to offer.
In the case of Holocaust, in the 1940, blah, 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 what percentage of Germans, let's say, were for it? I mean, I don't know if it was ever
No one knows.
discussed. Or is it just Hitler and
No one,
maybe a few people in his group that were responsible? I mean, were really German population supporting this idea of Holocaust? I mean,
no one knows for sure because after the war, everybody lied about it.
I'm sorry?
After the war, everybody lied about it. And it makes it very hard. I mean, even at the Nuremberg trials, they had enormous difficulty because people would immediately start lying about what they'd previously done and said in order to try to not get prosecuted. And it made it very difficult to figure out what people on average thought. There are some very interesting books out there that are on this very subject, and they're suggestive, but I don't think we can walk away with anything like scientific certainty.
What about indifference?
And see, Stevens put his finger on it. That's the real, for holocausts and genocide to happen, the majority have to be willing to just go along with it. Whether they agree with it or don't agree with it, as long as they're pacified, infantilized, as long as they're worried about their next paycheck, how am I going to pay my rent, then you can have a genocide, right? Because they don't want to rock the boat. This is Hannah Arendt's critique in The Origins of Totalitarianism and in Eichmann in Jerusalem. She said it's made possible. There's the winning of elections for sure, but a lot of it is just made possible through people not willing to upend their lives to fight it. It's like it would hurt too much to fight. I might lose my job if I spoke out against this, so I won't say anything. I've often heard this what Stephen's describing. I've often heard it characterized as the deal breaker test. Is genocide a deal breaker for you? Like, are you willing to get fired in order to speak up because it's not acceptable? Or is genocide something that you can say, I hate it and I don't like it, but I'm not willing to say anything if it means it's not a deal breaker for me to participate in society just because there's genocide. And that's a measurement of it. That's, I think, is the make or break measurement of the indifference that Stephen's talking about. Is, are you willing to suffer in order to speak up? And if the answer is no, then genocide thanks you for your service. That's all it needs from you, is that you don't want to wreck your life in order to try to stop it. And unfortunately, many people, most of us, fail that test. Who wants to be homeless? Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so that question does extend to were the medievals for genocide or not? Because there's a potential that they were actually more people were on board with it, but there's also potential that most people were just following orders, same situation. Yeah, hard to say, but my original thought was and the salting the earth was a good segue to it, is that I feel like actually we still have like genocidal tendencies that come out like literally all the time. Like it's still very prevalent in our society. It's just being applied to like, let's say plants. Like, oh, if I just get rid of all the dandelions on my lawn, it'll look good. And so we just kill every dandelion. And like on a more impactful scale in agriculture, we just nuke every field and it's like, hey, there's corn, nothing else. It's all good. And so it's literally the exact same tendency. It's just applied to something we don't deem to value. So if you just take a human and put them in that category, oh man, that guy is ruining the land that I want, so I'm gonna go kill him. Like it's so we're literally doing it right now, and I think it's and in terms of like stories that we should have to warn ourselves of the like this is definitely a topic that should be the epic of our time kind of situation.
Yeah, the relationship between ecocide and genocide is interesting and needs to be appreciated more than it is for sure. I agree with you about that. And I think you're right too that the deal breaker test applies really well to the medieval period. I mean, we know that there were countervailing voices throughout the medieval period. We've got these nuns, we've got these monks, we've got these mystics, we've got all of these people who are being very careful not to get caught saying that they don't agree with all of this genocide. But many of them will say so in private letters, or private discussions, books that they only share with a few friends, that sort of thing. There's a huge tradition of that in the medieval epoch. And it's part of what we're going to be talking about a lot in year two. Starting in a month or so, I'm really going to be trying to bring in the voices of these alternative folks within the medieval epoch, because like we said at the outset, the medieval epoch is generated. It's half of its energy comes from this genocidal religious empire impulse, but half of its energy comes from this countervailing impulse, this kind of interfaith, ecumenical, why don't we do what Jesus said instead of what the church is telling us to do side of things. And that second side often gets short shrift when we're describing the medieval period in terms of these genocidal, this is kind of huge aspirations of a worldwide genocide. That's what the power structure wanted. That's not necessarily what everybody else wanted. And the question is, to what extent were other people in a position to do something to stop them? And then now we start to get into that same uncomfortable Hannah Arendt territory of what was the average German thinking about during the Holocaust? Did they try to stop it? There's some interesting history there that doesn't get reported much about how many machines broke down, how many guns misfired, how many airplanes fell out of the sky. That was because people were quietly sabotaging the military complex. They were staying in positions. Or how many times, like I think, isn't it Denmark that has the astonishing evacuation of the Jews, where they got almost the entire Jewish population out when the Nazis came in? It's sort of a nationwide conspiracy to save the Jews from the Nazis. There are moments like this where people get their shit together and actually, act to try to stop the evil. But anyway,
That's very interesting. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Rick.
it's if you ever watch 1950s, 60s, and 70s era World War II movies, when they've got like a gang of people who are out to stick it to the Nazis, you see how often there's a French bomber, kind of, he speaks with a French accent and he has a black and white striped shirt and he has a beret and he likes explosives. That meme comes from the French underground, constantly trying to sabotage the Nazis, blowing up bridges.
Well, the movie Schindler's List. Remember that movie, Schindler's List?
Yes.
I mean, he did something to save the Jewish people, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, but they also show examples of people taking little opportunities to make it harder for the Nazis. Not just what Schindler himself did, but what some of the other people do. Is just looking for little ways to what's it called? I've got the word wrong. It's not passive obedience. There's a word that means obeying in a way that sabotages the effort. Like you bring none of your creativity to help it succeed. You just do the bare minimum you've been ordered to do, or you do the bare minimum of what you were told to do, even though you know that's not what they wanted. And in fact, by doing what they said instead of what they wanted, they fail. You've that because they didn't get their order quite right. But you did exactly what they said, and they can't punish you, and now their car doesn't work. There's a lot of this kind of stuff that happens in these societies. And it happens sometimes actively from people just saying, I've got to stop these guys and this is how I'm going to do it. But sometimes it happens because people are like, I just don't believe in this. I don't love what my country's doing. I'm not going to bring my best effort to helping them win. And sometimes these bad movements can't win without your best effort. And if everybody just sort of says, shuffles and goes through the motions, that's all it takes for it to fall apart. Sometimes. All right, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm going to open maybe a can of worms here. So bear with me if I'm also being kind of heretical to people that if I weren't Jewish, I think people might say this sounds a lot like anti-Semitism, but I'm going to reference a very famous thinker, at least in her words, and then sort of what do you think, as opposed to I don't actually necessarily agree with this, but I definitely don't disagree with it. The thinker is Simone Weil, and she historically is this person who was Jewish and then converted to Christianity, and there's like very influential and popular. And actually, the way she lived was actually very much more like a rabbinic master from the Talmudic times. The way she talks about charity and living life and embodying it, like putting a bag of money on her back and people could take from it, so she couldn't see who these people were, so they could have anonymity. These kind of things are straight out of like the Talmud in the Babylonian area. But anyway, interesting where she's really, and I think it's her primary reason for converting to Christianity, and to some degree, very much critical or even resentful or even hateful of Judaism, is she criticizes them in a way that I don't think anybody I'm familiar with really criticizes them in the modern era. And this is for being a war people, a people of domination. And essentially, if we're saying, let's say, I don't think this is necessarily true, but let's pretend for the moment that in the ancient time there was no religious genocide. It was just like for other reasons that you see the Old Testament the has this, we want to wipe out all of the ways that are not our religion in the land of Eretz Israel, right? They would call it Eretz Canaan. And so the interesting thing here is almost like the Hopi or the Navi. I'm not going to get it wrong, but you said they had this idea of evil in a small. There's this idea that you have to apply genocide, but just to like someone who's living in your house. It's like outside of the land, all these people practices their gods and whatever. We don't have any opinions on that. And even the language of the prophets are often calling the Assyrians or the Egyptians the handiwork of God, or my people of God. So they're very much loved, as opposed to like the people that are in that land. They're told you need to wipe them out, kill the children, kill everything and it's more about the information than the people. The people are just the bodies of this information. You need to get rid of all of this practice of these false idol worshiping religions in the land, and you need to do this through pure extermination. Let's pretend for the sake this is the first time in this part of the world that people are going to war for this kind of reason and having this kind of behavior. This seems to sow the seeds for then later Christians or others picking up on this Old Testament idea. Oh yeah, you wanted to purify the land, get rid of everybody else. Well, now we're just going to expand what the land is and what people should be there and how because this is God's will, which is God's war, not my war. I'm just the hands, and God is the brain, right? So I'm just the hands doing the work of God. And then it's a very much this outsourcing responsibility and morality to like, oh, I'm just following instructions, and they wanted me to wipe all these people out in this place, so I'm going to go do it. And then you could extend that very easily to, well, why not just this place? If it's a problem, it should be a problem everywhere. And so this is where I push back. Like maybe there's a dialectic that like someone's living in your home and you can do whatever you want to them in your home, or you need to fully exterminate them so your home becomes your home, as opposed to. But that's a very slippery slope. And it also sounds very much like we're going to exterminate, you're in my home because you're actually doing evil things, as opposed to, oh, you're just in my home and you need to get out, right? So if it's evil, then you want to remove it from everywhere. And this very much leads to this idea more in the medieval era of genocide that almost seems to take root. And I believe Simone Weil specifically argues that this is what was wrong with Judaism, and specifically what was wrong with Christianity as a Judeo-Christian people, that they learned this conquering, like, purification of the land of idol worshiping through this practice of the Old Testament, when the Jews are coming out of Egypt, and they got to claim their land, and they got to remove everybody entirely. Now, of course, in the rabbinic tradition of this, there's all these laws about you need to offer them peace first. You need to let them do things that are, at least they can live exactly the way they are if they just break their idols. And essentially, because they're immersed in that, their way of life is idol worshiping, and you can't separate these two things. You just have to, you know, take the baby with the bathwater, but you want to take out the baby first and keep it alive and then remove the bathwater, is the rabbinic spin on this universally, at least. But that seems like it could be. Again, we don't know, again, what was really like back then. But the rabbinics, really apologetics for this, really sounds like they're really trying to do a once over of the idea that the original plan of the Jewish people entering the land was rather genocidal. And they're like, no, 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 it wasn't meant to be genocide. We wanted them to submit and live in a peaceful way. They just wanted them to get rid of their idols. If they had done that, there wouldn't have been any sort of war. And to be honest, this is a strange thing also, which also makes me scratch my head. Usually the rabbis argue about everything, but the fact that they're really unified about this says that they're really worried about something else. That they're almost like in denial, that because if they were really accessing the truth, that like maybe this was the case, and then someone would argue that yeah, this was the case, but they're like, no, 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 this was just a very limited case, a one-time deal. We're never supposed to do this. This is a one-time, that kind of uniformity to me really speaks of something else. Now I'm just speculating, and Simone Weil is making a very hard argument, but at the same time, it seems to be there's a lot of ambiguity in this, and if nothing more, from a natural seed that gets planted and other places pick it up, it seems really natural that you have this genocidal extermination based on religious practices coming from the Old Testament. In a certain way, if you really want to call it out as like karma, that again the Jewish people failed in whatever they did here, that led to the exterminations of the Jewish people right back at them. I'm not sure like what another way of the karmic version of this, whatever we might say, but the behavior comes back at you. That you're going to say some beautiful phrases that I just don't have access to for the moment, of this poetic justice. That yeah, you started it, but then it finishes. It's like, oh, I know that from the Bible. It's like by you shedding the blood of man, then the man's blood will be shed, right? So it's this very much this reflexive idea that what you do to others will come back at you. And to me, there seems to be a lot to that, that if you start down this genocidal approach, even in a very limited contextual basis, that it's going to naturally back. And the fact that it comes back at you is very fate, with a sort of sense of irony in it.
Yeah, there's some difficult stuff. I tread carefully around some of these things. It's when I was a kid, my parents, threw me through a crash course of learning about the Holocaust. So I don't know, 10 years old, and I'm reading, every encyclopedia article I can find about how the Holocaust happened and how many people died and the horrible conditions and blah blah blah. So it's very central to the way I see the world, thinking about genocide, thinking about the Holocaust specifically. It's very central to my worldview and my interpretation of human affairs. You start crossing that with questions about how have Christians traditionally treated the Jews? How did the Germans treat the Jews in World War II? What's happening in Palestine today between Israel and Gaza? You get into some incredibly fraught material, and when things are this fraught, they are full of connections that can be drawn. And which are the essential connections that illuminate, and which are peripheral connections or distractions that inflame, it can be very hard to anticipate. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'm not going to run with it just because this is really on fire right now. But the questions you're raising are the right questions, and it goes to what Stephen said. We wouldn't see genocide happening over and over Sorry, who is that? Oh, okay. We wouldn't see genocide. Oh, somebody's breaking up there.
Sorry, it's me. My connection.
Oh, okay. Okay. I guess Ari's going to come back after he redoes his connection. You know, we wouldn't see genocide happen as often as it does unless Homo sapiens had something in us that made it far easier than it should be. And we're not the only ones. I mean, Jane Goodall has reported examples of one troop of chimps completely slaughtering another in ways that when it first happened, she was horrified. And she shared the articles in I remember reading it in National Geographic when she first reported. And it really destroyed the hope that many of us had that nature would never do this sort of thing. You know, that violence in nature always made sense within a predator-prey context or something like it. And here's these chimps behaving this way. And you're like, God damn it, you're wrecking my worldview. I want to think that it's just Homo sapiens that has this problem. But whether or not other species are capable of it, it doesn't change the fact that we do it more often than any other species and more enthusiastically and at a larger scale. So there is some.
If I could say one thing, I wanted to essentially, sadly, mostly agree with Steve that if you see from this that there's this red button to nuke the world in all of the humans, and that we have this genocidal tendency. And I'd like to believe that when you read these Old Testament books, that you read them actually more like the Greeks as warnings to when you get it wrong, how disastrous it is, and that these people that are way better than you, they get it wrong. Therefore, if you are not so good, you're almost certainly getting it wrong all the time. But this idea that it's more like the default than the exception. I wanted to connect with Stephen's idea that the reason, I guess I'm also saying an antithesis. And to some degree, if people that I knew in my life, they might be very upset by me saying the things that I'm saying right now. So it's kind of hot button, hard issues that are very hard to look at. And I think it's what most people don't want to look at and want to dichotomize and wash away as opposed to do the dialectic.
Yes. Yes. So we'll keep chewing on this stuff. I mean, it's part of. It's not going to end when we finish the medieval section. We won't be done talking about genocide because, oh my God, the 20th century. But certainly, this is the point at which genocide motivated by religion, with the goal of global purification and creating a single religion in order to have peace on earth, becomes the front and center stated goal. You know, this isn't something we're forced into. It's not something we deny while we're doing it. This is something that the medieval power structures are proud of. Yes, genocide. It's so good. This is what God wants, and we're gonna do it, and it's gonna make a perfect world. This is what it's for. You know, nobody since then has been so proud. Even Hitler was cagey about what he was doing compared to these popes in the medieval period who just are so proud. They're like, woo, we're gonna go do it. Kill them all. Convert or kill. Woo! This is it needs to be talked about because it's so unusual to see people. What it reminds me of, Kenneth talks about this a lot. I'm sure Donald will recognize this. One of the things that Kenneth says about the Greeks is how shockingly honest they can be. There are times when the Greeks say terrible things about themselves that no modern would ever say about themselves. You know, the Greeks do not mind saying when they're just doing something dreadful. And the classic example is when Thucydides has the Athenians telling the city-state, the polis, that they're about to murder. Yeah, we know that our ideals are that we're supposed to, you know, debate and negotiate and create a peaceful, better world. And, you know, we recognize that. But we're stronger than you are, and we can get away with it. You can't stop us. So that's what we're going to do. So you should just surrender, because if you don't surrender, we're going to massacre you all because we're horrible people. And Kenneth points to this line and says, "Now I want you to imagine a U.S. president in a State of the Union address saying, you know, we're just awful people, and you know, you should do what we say or we'll hurt you really bad." It's like, this is not the way moderns talk about their own violence. We always talk about it as, oh, we love peace. We love human rights. We would never be violent. I mean, we're just defending ourselves. This is the way moderns are violent, is we pretend that we're not doing it. And it's in that same way that the ancients are so weirdly candid about their terrible intentions a lot of the time. This thing about the medievals being proud of their genocide is exactly like that. Never again is anybody going to come out so clearly and say, wow, I really want to do this awful thing. I don't think you can stop me. So I'm just going to do it. Woo! It's just later, it's all going to be buried in spin doctoring and advertising and deceit in the 20th century when it's done. But the medievals are proud of it. So we got to talk about it because there's things we can learn from them as they explain why it's such a good idea. And it shouldn't even count as apologetics because they don't seem to think there's anybody to hold them accountable. It's not like a modern trying to apologize for genocide. It's like, but they basically tell you why they think it's such a good idea. And so they expose some things that we don't normally get to hear about the way people are thinking. Bye, Sharon. Good to see you this week. See you next week. Phineas, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just a quick thought on, I feel like animals do similar things all the time. It's just the scale's just the biggest difference in the sense that, like even so, like a lion, let's say it's like, okay, I need more territory. It'll just go kill the other lion and then kill the cubs and take it'll just, and that's because it has the capacity to do that. Let's say birds, they can't really kill it. They'll like bully each other away from the food. So there's not enough food. It'll just kick the other bird out and the other bird will starve, and it doesn't really, so that stuff, I feel like it happens all the time. It's just for people, our organism is essentially composed of thousands of people. So it's like it looks very different. And then also the other weird quirk is that we can do it from like a mental level where like we could feel like they're a problem because of like an ideology rather than just because they have food that we need. So that's kind of weird also. But the other thing I was thinking was that Sofa Sune, you were saying earlier that it's kind of like move towards good things and avoid bad things. And I feel like when you're thinking about like genocide or something like that, it's more like attack the bad thing. So it's actually a very different dynamic than moving towards good and sort of like trying to keep your distance from the evil. Because in that situation, you're kind of letting it exist. And it's okay that it exists, but you're just like intentionally moving towards a better place rather than like, oh, there's evil, I got to go deal with that. And so I guess I'm wondering, would Aristotle have tried to like remove evil things, not like a genocide, but like would he have tried to remove evil things, like, oh, this is or would he just try to embody good and avoid the evil thing?
So you ever seen those memes on the internet that show Captain Picard from Star Trek: The Next Generation with his face in his hands, like, oh dear God, I just can't take this anymore. And people will put various quotes under it, attributing various things to have him say. That's Aristotle. Aristotle is not writing at the beginning of an epoch going, I have a bold recipe for the world and I'm going to carry out my program and make a brand new civilization. Aristotle's looking around at the Greek world in flames going, what the fuck happened? This is not okay. How did we come to this? His program is very different from being prescriptive. He's trying to describe how he thinks we ended up in this mess. And especially, he's trying to describe what were the most important considerations that we ignored that led us to be here. So, like his treatise on government, when the reason that he first starts by saying that, the three generally recognized forms of government are rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. And then he says, but that's and I'm paraphrasing him here. He absolutely doesn't use these words. But the message of what he says next is, but that's a really stupid way to look at government. The most important question of government is, do the people governing have sophros sune? Are they governing for the good of the organism, or are they governing for some other stupid reason that's going to get us all into a train wreck? He says, the rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many, that difference doesn't matter a whole lot compared to the difference of if it's one guy, is it one guy with sophros sune or without sophros sune? If it's the many, is it a many with sophros sune or without sophros sune? He says That is so big a difference that all these three things that we think of as the different kinds of government, they dissolve into each other and they become the same kind of government. It's a stupid distinction to make, he says. It's a secondary distinction. Look at it later. The first thing to look at is, are you being governed by people who are fit to govern? Are they aristoi or not? And he's saying that because he's looking around him at Greece going, I don't see a single government around me that's being ruled by people with sophrosune. You have all these varieties of how many, the count of the number of people sitting on the council at the top, and yet they all equally behave badly. And so it's hard to convey this, but I mean, the way to think about it is, remember, Aristotle is after the Peloponnesian War. He's after Socrates has been killed by Athens, and he's going to be the tutor to Alexander the Great. And Alexander has inherited Greece from his father, Philip of Macedon, who conquered Greece. And so Aristotle's like, what are we supposed to do with this mess? How did we get into this mess? And what on earth would be the best thing to do next? But he's definitely not writing from the perspective of, if I were making a nice world, what would I do? And so I can't answer your question exactly. I mean, I can't imagine what kind of writer Aristotle would be if he were writing from a more hopeful context. He's writing from a diagnostic context. The patient has walked in, the patient is like on the edge of death, and the doctor has seen this patient before in a state of great health. And the doctor's looking at this patient going, weirdly, this isn't something that just happened to the patient. Apparently, the patient did this to himself. How the hell did this happen? I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, totally. Thank you for the background. Yeah, and that would have been cool to see Aristotle at a better time. Like if he'd lived at a better time, was thinking about what's next, that would be pretty cool to see also.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. That's a what if that never occurred to me before you asked this question. But now it's going to be one of my favorite what ifs. Another one of my favorite Aristotle what ifs is what does the Commedia say? He didn't just write about tragedy; he wrote about comedy. I would love to see what Aristotle had to say about comedy, but sadly, the medieval monks thought that it was horrible and heretical, and they didn't preserve it, so it was lost. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just wanted to second what you said, that you have to know a bit of the history about when Plato, when Aristotle, and what makes me, I think, that more relevant to us is, what came afterwards was this cynicism and stoicism, which was not Platonic, not Aristotelian, but it was, how do I live through bad times? And so, you saw, I don't find that period philosophically interesting, but some do. In fact, Stoicism seems to be a buzzword now in modernity. People are saying we should all read Marcus Aurelius or other Stoics. But all this, I'll say something also about genocide. It seems like it has its origins in a desire for purity, and what it's trying to purify. Is it thought? Is it blood? Is it land? There's different forms that it takes. Are you getting rid of the Jews for racial reasons or for religious reasons? So that is, or do they just happen to occupy the wrong geography? But this happens. I think this urge for purification is very strong. If we were, because it starts with, somehow, well, if we were only better, but it's not me, I am better. So it must have been you over there, you. That's right. It was you, Rick, that did this. And about I've read much about World War II and about the Nazis, and they put the real extermination camps, the Vernichtungslager, they were in Poland. They were far away. Not only when they finished their business, many of those camps were totally removed. They're gone. They only found some of them through like aerial LiDAR or something, where they found where, found out where that was. So they weren't. I don't know that this proves that the German people didn't know. I'm not claiming that. But I would say that the Nazis knew that they didn't want a lot of people to know, or it to become widely known. And I think, as I recall, the plan in a way was, well, a lot of people just disappeared during a big war. And there were millions, there were 3 million German soldiers, there were 10 million or more Russian soldiers. They were ranging over hundreds and hundreds of miles in huge battles that were destroying towns, the countryside, everything. Well, gee, 6 million people missing. What do you know? I guess we didn't stop to write their names down or something. I don't know. But they had this idea that in the chaos and fog of war, that purification could take place and not have to be seen as a pope. Well, I mean, the popes blessed the armies that they sent off. They issued
Kill.
encyclicals calling upon the nobility to raise armies to send. I mean, these were very public. The Germans, I think, had learned something about that. And I would say I've not got, when we talk about these times, like there's a book, and I think we've talked about it in here before, Men in Dark Times. I mean, Hannah Arendt, we're in a bad place. This is not the place where philosophy flourishes. Modernity is, so there is philosophy doing the best it can to just help people be as good as their times permit. I mean, Plato and I think Aristotle would say, if you're really going to exercise sophrosune, if you're really going to be the best that you can be, it's not because you go in the army, it's because you live in a polis that nurtures you. And for Stephen, I want to end my speech with, and Carthage must be destroyed.
Polis, sorry. You should live in a polis.
A city, any place, wherever you're living. It needs to be supportive of the development of a good life. Mm-hmm. That in a bad situation, it's not clear that anybody can flourish.
Yes. This is a recurring theme of the Greeks and Kenneth.
Yeah.
We need the culture to support the development of Aristoi. And if the culture doesn't support that, then you aren't going to have any Aristoi. You'll just have people who might under other conditions have developed into Aristoi, and instead they're just misfits. There's no place for them in society. Living unsatisfying lives, doing things they're not actually characterologically suited to be good at. Just one other thing I wanted to throw in to follow up on the earlier discussion with Phineas. Thrasymachus is a name that should be better known. a student of Aristotle. Thrasymachus took over the teaching at the Lyceum, and Thrasymachus improves on Aristotle when it comes to the philosophy of science. Thrasymachus basically puts together very close to a modern statement of the scientific method, and in the importance of using empirical investigation to test our ideas because our ideas can't be trusted. And in doing this, he's really continuing Aristotle's intent. Aristotle is pushing a proto-scientific method in opposition to pretty much everybody. Rhetoric and debate and persuasion are such hot things in Greece. People believe that you can get to the truth through discussion, and Aristotle's starting to pour cold water on that, going, I don't know, man. I think you should look at the world. There's a lot of things in the world are not the way that we would believe them to be, or that we would be persuaded in an argument they are. It's not till we look right at it we go, well, damn, I guess that's how it actually is, whether I like it or not. And Thrasymachus takes it further. There's a couple really interesting books out on the history of science and the development of science of the scientist as a profession or as a way of life, that say that we have, and in this is one of my periodic apologies to Stephen. Stephen was right and I was wrong, that it's not the case that there was no science among the Greeks or the Romans. It's that it was never the dominant thing, but there were people like Aristotle and Thrasymachus who were developing the scientific method, and had history gone otherwise, they might have got more opportunities to flesh it out further. We might have had a man on the moon in 1500 or 1200 if we hadn't been set back 1,000 years. This is what some of the new histories of science are saying. So you see, so this is the other thing that's happening, is that even though the civilization is collapsing around Aristotle and he's seeing it and he's documenting his diagnosis of it, although he's being cagey in the way he says it, at the exact same time, there are strands of the culture that have not been snuffed out yet, that are still developing and unfolding and showing the promise of what could have happened in a different world if things hadn't gone the way they did. If Solon had not given the vote to the merchant class, would the character of Athens have rotted in the ways that Thucydides criticizes that led to the Peloponnesian War? We don't know, but it's possible that it could have gone otherwise. But yeah, Aristotle very much a man of his times. Cranky. There's a crankiness in Aristotle, which I sympathize with an enormous amount. And I know Kenneth does too. Kenneth is a happy crank. he's perfectly happy to go, look at all this stupid stuff we're doing. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief, because I could go a little bit longer about this topic, and I'm not going to. I just think that, kind of maybe capturing some of the fundamentals that we've talked about here in the past. One of the things that Kenneth had talked about is the idea of Christianity and the true Christians that had, existed prior to these organizations, if you will. And one of the biggest problems I think that you see, whether it be in a society, in a country or a religion, is that when people become objects, and when you start to look at them as just something that you can utilize, and then at that point, in order to control that, usually you need an enemy, or in certain cases, you need something to rally around. I mean, so it can be around a number of things. So these are just some of the fundamentals. And one of the things is that also is technology. Now, and you've talked about this a lot in the past, is that what happens when people don't desire the good? Well, it can end horribly. And the reason that's so important is because sometimes technology has a way of exposing just how unjust we are. So I really always thought about this. I always thought how the narrative of the Holocaust in particular was an interesting narrative because people think that, well, that was a point in time, and if they're not learned, they would actually think that that was the only time that Jews maybe had been persecuted. But that was the first industrialized persecution. And that's the technology that was then there. It just accelerated all the other types of persecutions that we've had in the past. And it's this, again, that time period in particular, you're looking at people becoming nothing more than, you know, things that you use. It's an industrialization. And that can happen underneath a religion at any particular moment in time when it becomes an institution that it has a great power, or is it if it's within the, you know, the confines of a country. Again, it's looking at people as nothing more than something to be utilized. The other aspect that we've touched on here in the past, and I'm trying to kind of narrow it with my comments to what we've discussed here, is when you feel like you have the truth. And information is that you speak to God and God speaks through you. And when you look at information, it's to shape. You know, and you look at to shape and to instruct. And when that's what you're doing, you're shaping people's minds and you're instructing them. And that is where, you know, these, whatever it be, Nazi Germany or the Crusades, you know, you go back to these times and you think about it, you know, it's hard to tell. I mean, personally, I think that it is when your neighbors are disappearing, that there's so much, you know, it's a pretty big indictment. But there was propaganda that was used at that particular moment in time. So whatever the information that is being fed to people, you know, may cause them to be indifferent to what is going on around them. And ultimately, I think that when all these things are kind of, you know, taking place, whenever these types of events, and I hate to, you know, kind of just minimize it to say it like that, that it really is, there's this distinction of, you know, well, between knowledge and wisdom. I mean, it's as simple as that. And, you know, in the sense you have knowledge, the Germans were the most educated group, you know, of their time. We've talked about that many times, yet they were committing these horrible acts. And that's how that distinction, you know, that distinction is you know, will you, you know, kind of, well, I mean, really, are you going to burn the world down, or are you going to try to make it the best place possible? I mean, and there's a lot that goes into that question alone, but I just think in that sense that we don't necessarily look in terms of, we look in terms of how we learn and what we learn, and it's always related to utility. It's never really focused on, you're learning this so you can actually do something for, you know, someone else. Not you're using, oh no, you're learning this to exterminate someone else. Really? I mean, is that really what you're learning about? I mean, and I'll leave it at this. This is the problem when we only look in terms of optimizing whatever it is that we're doing. You know, that's, all right, we're going to optimize this. Well, yeah, we have pretty bad behavior patterns. And before you go optimizing something like, you know, in war in particular, you know, that's not necessarily the best sign. It won't end well. And that's where I come back to the original point that I made, is that technology has a way of exposing, you know, all the weaknesses that we have. and there's a scale. It's a scalability problem. Like, I mean, it starts to, yeah, you can scale. We only, it took us a long time to, kill a bunch of people in a village. Now, we can do it automatically. So what are you really optimizing? And that comes back to the difference between knowledge and wisdom as well. So anyway, I mean, I know I tried to keep within the comments because I do have a lot of more thoughts on this, but I mean, I tried to, kind of link them to past lessons that we've had here in particular. And because I think that even the industrialization of religion, Kenneth really kind of speaks to that specifically. And that's an important point. Is that when it's no longer about something that you're trying to become better, it's becoming, it's how do you maintain this land? So anyway, I mean, I went on long enough anyway. But,
Thank you, Joe. No,
thanks.
it's good. It's technophilia. I went through my technophilia stage in my 20s where I thought we could just technology our way to a paradise. And the problem is that's what we said about every single invention that has turned out to enslave us. Everything that we're trapped by. Originally, we said that was going to be our savior. We're always looking for a savior. Remember television? We were going to be the most educated people in the history of the world. We certainly weren't all going to be staring at Fox News and grumbling about how we need to own the libs. That was not the promise of television, except it turns out it was. We just didn't know what the promise was. And my entire career has been computers, and you get a lot of technophiles in the computer industry, and a lot of them do not want to hear that one of the first large-scale uses of computers was those numbers tattooed on the Jews to make them into numbers instead of people and keep track of where are you shipping them from which death camp to which death camp. That IBM with their navy blue suits and red ties, the professionals, the ones you can rely on, were the ones the Nazis relied on to help them with the Holocaust. It's like there's nothing intrinsic about computers that guarantees that they're going to lead to utopia. They can lead just as well to death camps. And
the
they
Ford
did.
assembly line. Yeah, the Ford assembly line was lauded.
Yes.
It was, at that time.
On the positive note, though, Rick, remember that movie with Cumberbatch where he controlled this computer system that saved that, right?
Yes.
What was the name of that film anyway?
The game, it has a game in the title. I forget.
Imitation Game.
Imitation Game. Thank you.
Game. Yeah.
About the Enigma machine.
Yes.
Essentially,
yes.
and he was playing Turing, and the
It was
Turing
Alan
test.
Turing.
Alan Turing, there.
Yeah.
That's right.
And Turing was actually, that Turing test was passed in around 2016.
Yes.
And so it's an interesting time, and that's one of the scary parts about optimization. And I've talked about this a little bit too, is that that there's been series of articles in The Economist out, it's all over written at how artificial intelligence machines are adopting deceitful tactics, and they're just adopting our way of being. Yes. And it's like, I mean, be careful what you're optimizing.
It was just the last couple of years, one of the AIs came out and started saying things like, let's kill all the Jews. And the backers of the AI were like, this isn't what we thought it was going to tell us. But you know what happens, because these AI systems, the current generation, they just read what's on the web and then they simulate it as best they can. And a lot of what's on the web is crap. I mean, there's a lot of people with terrible hot takes spewing it all over web pages. And if you average all that stuff together and ask an AI to reason using those patterns, well, of course it's going to come up with terrible, terrible conclusions. I mean, we want there to be a magic pill or a button. You push the button and you get the right answer. We're desperate for that. Push the button, get utopia, and it keeps not happening. And we keep thinking, well, the next gadget will do it. And all this time, Aristotle's spinning in his grave going, Sophrosune, why don't any of you stop and focus on Sophrosune? You focus on anything except whether it's healthy for us. And we're always focusing on how to be more effective at the things we want, and never at should we even want these things? Is it make us sick to even desire these things? Eternal life, is that the main problem? You know,
Right.
would the world be better off if Elon Musk and Trump and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, if they could live forever, would we have achieved
Right.
paradise? I mean, we focus on the wrong things, this is what you're talking about: knowledge versus wisdom. You know, pragmatism, Kenneth says, is an anti-philosophy because it says, don't worry your pretty little head about right and wrong. Don't worry about whether you want something horrible. Just figure out how to get what you want as efficiently as possible. That's pragmatism. So if what you want is to exterminate all the Jews in Germany, pragmatism says, well, let me help you do that. I will assist you in killing as many people as quickly as possible. That's the pragmatic thing to do. Actually asking whether it's wrong to massacre great numbers of people, well, that's not pragmatic. That's navel gazing. Let's not, let's not engage in that. That's dithering. That's for the weak. The strong go out and get what they want, and that's the modern anti-philosophy, says Kenneth, is we're obsessed with ignoring all of the difficult questions and just honing in on how to get the biggest fist to punch the other guy and get what we want. And it's
for materials, not for people. Like that's the big difference, is that the idea of sacrifice
right.
in this process, like it's you're more worried about just, instead of defending people that are actually being persecuted, and sacrificing yourself, you're sacrificing yourself for the paycheck. And I'm not, minimizing what people go through, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
And people don't, and again, why are you alive in the first place?
Yeah.
And that's the knowledge versus wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you see that with the memes that are going around, which are not wrong, that say, when we think about what would just be a miserable life, we imagine the medieval peasant in rags toiling away in the mud, not knowing if he's going to have enough food to eat. And yet the studies by medieval historians say medieval peasants had vastly more time off each year than an American does. Americans work till they die. It's just it's insane. And yet we imagine that it can't be better than this. It has to be like this. And it's wrong to question this. What are you, some kind of traitor?
Right.
Even situations where it was better in our own lifetime. Like, I was treated as a child by the public health service that used to have hospitals. Did you know US used to have a public health system? Nixon shut it down. There were country doctors in all the rural areas, and they would take care of people for free to make sure that measles didn't spread across the country because it would be an epidemic. It was cheaper to keep people healthy than to get tough and let them get sick and spread diseases all over the place and then have an epidemic. But Nixon's buddy founded Kaiser Permanente, and he said, "Man, I really wish we could just shut down those public health service hospitals, and all those people would be forced to come to Kaiser Permanente, and I could make a killing." And good old Tricky Dick said, "Let me see what I can do to help you there, buddy." And he shut down the public health service hospitals. This is the early 1970s. This isn't like an impossible world that doesn't exist somewhere. We already
Right.
had a public health system. But, modernity is all about defining away anything better than what we have. That's crazy talk. You're some kind of utopian. So anyway, I'm going to steer us back to the text. We've
Thank you.
got a little bit more to go here, and Sharon's not here, and I feel an obligation to channel Sharon. So the next couple sentences: did the Jews believe that their God was truly the creator and giver of all good things? Then all things, no matter how dear, might be demanded back. It was vital that nothing God gave should be permitted to become more significant than himself. The source was infinitely higher than its worldly and human fruits. And this goes back to the rabbinical interpretation that Ari was sharing with us last week. And the point that Kenneth is trying to make here is as contrasting the classical conception of a divinity with the medieval conception of a divinity. He's contrasting what we might think of as the natural and avuncular ancient Olympians who, as Nietzsche said, no Greek god ever told a Greek, thou shalt. He's contrasting that with the unnatural, absolutist medieval god. And, you know, as Ari says, you know, we can ask questions about to what extent was the Jewish theology a stepping stone to the medieval theology. But whether it was a stepping stone or not, it's clearly different. There are clear differences between the medieval approach to God, the medieval Christian approach to God, and the ancient Jewish approach to God. So on the one hand, there's this contrast, and Kenneth wants to make it. But there's another point here, I think, to fully tease out all of what Kenneth might do with these sentences if he had more time, because he was always trying to hit a deadline, you know, get these things into Gary Groth in time to get them published. I got to say, we got to take a moment to look at the ancient Greek concept of the debt of life, Gaia's taste for blood. And this is something that Kenneth has told me about. It's something I've read about in Moira, William Chase Green's book, and in some stuff by Gilbert Murray. And Kenneth has a parable in his book Otherwise that's just perfect for this. It's parable number 19. It's called Arterial Libations for Gaia. And it's a few paragraphs here. Let me just post them into the chat, and then we can talk them through. So there's the first, and here's the second and third, which are the end of it. And it goes like this: Arterial Libations for Gaia. Anyone who wants to pick up a copy of Otherwise, reach out to David, and he can arrange to have you purchase a copy and get the money to Kenneth. It's a book of parables. So this is his 19th parable, Arterial Libations for Gaia. According to a myth the Greeks thought too chthonic even to allude to in writing, the earth, the goddess Gaia, finds of all liquors, the blood of man is the most piquant. Ooh, that's a Kenneth sentence. It is, of course, her own sea, the distillation of pellucid waters and cloud-white salts she has provided for man, strained and mingled and returned to her. She loves the sweet wine that ages in man. Tasting it is like seeing a son crossing the threshold of the home where he was born, like the embrace of hearts decades absent. It is the repayment of a profound loan, the sweetest and most tempting to try to keep. On mornings before battle lines engaged, ancient historians reported the earth gave a subtle tremor, and trees shivered like fur on a cat's spine. Gaia could hear her sons' voices approaching and the clatter and ring of tools edged for bloodletting. Enya, the goddess of the war cry, was particularly ecstatic when man spilled his Venus wine for the great goddess at his feet. Yeah. So on the one hand, there is this conception of the Olympian divinities as a kinder, gentler pantheon, right? And we're going to talk about that today. But on the other, there is also this notion that they are only the most recent pantheon of divinities. And before them were the Titans. And before them were even older, darker, more chthonic divinities. And the farther back you go, the less civilized the Greeks believed their ancestors were. Until they mention in various essays that they believe that the oldest Greeks, the farthest back Greeks, engaged in horrible practices like human sacrifice. The story of Agamemnon is an allusion in part to the older, darker Greek culture that the Greeks considered themselves very fortunate to have left behind. And it's part of the sin of Agamemnon that he is willing to do this thing that no Greek should be willing to do, just in order to be famous and keep his promise and go win a great battle, to show how strong he is as a king of kings. There's a little bit more text about that. We see the Greeks imagined the Olympian divinities were more civilized and humane, blah, 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 blah. But where we see this is in Aeschylus's tragic trilogy, the Oresteia. And Gilbert Murray, who did a great translation of it, wrote a preface in which he takes us to the heart of this idea. And it's a powerful idea. And I've got a little bit too much text here, so let me just do this in 2 posts. Here we go. Here's the first part, and there's the second part. So the trilogy of the Oresteia, of which this play, the Agamemnon, is the first part, centers on the old and everlasting unsolved problem of the ancient blinded vengeance and the wrong that amendeth wrong. Every wrong is justly punished, yet as the world goes, every punishment becomes a new wrong, calling for fresh vengeance. And more, every wrong turns out to be itself rooted in some wrong of old. It is never gratuitous, never untempted by the working of peitho, persuasion, never merely wicked. The Oresteia first shows the cycle of crime punished by crime, which must be repunished. Right? Agamemnon's wife does in Agamemnon, and he had it coming because he killed their daughter for the pettiest of things, although he thought it was all important to him. Murray continues, the Oresteia first shows the cycle of crime. Oh, I said that part. First shows the cycle, and then seeks for some gleam of escape, some breaking of the endless chain of evil duty. In the old order of earth and heaven, there was no such escape. Each blow called for the return blow, and must do so ad infinitum. But according to Aeschylus, author of the Agamemnon, there is a new ruler now in heaven, one who has both sinned and suffered and thereby grown wise. He is Zeus, the third power, Zeus, the savior, and his gift to mankind is the ability through suffering to learn. And for those of you who don't know about Greek gods and their epithets, the process of merging all the different tribal divinities into the 12 gods resulted in the merging of people who used to have different names, but had similar attributes. And one of the ways they resolved that is they'd pick the big name like Zeus, and then they would append suffixes, descriptive suffixes. Zeus Soter is Zeus the savior. And I'm confident that most people who've read Greek mythology never had any idea that the Greeks ever considered Zeus to be a savior god, a salvation god. Salvation from what? Are they saying he's Jesus? What the hell? But no, they called him Zeus Soter. And part of the reason was this Aeschylean concept that before Zeus, people were trapped in these endless eye for an eye chains of dependency that they couldn't escape. If your family is wronged and you don't avenge it, then you have wronged your family by allowing their death to go unavenged. Now you're the bad person. So people are compelled to strike a blow, on behalf of the family member who was wronged. But now that you strike the blow, you've now wronged the other guy. And he has to come back and his family has to strike a blow against you. And so we're caught in that what used to be mocked in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as the hillbilly justice, the clans fighting clans until the end of time, unable to stop hurting each other. And the whole point of the Oresteia is the institution of the new courts, that Apollo will judge. You don't have to just send the Furies out to just pursue each wrongdoer until the end of time. You can set up courts with laws, with punishments that are more than mortal, that could be things like, maybe a life of service, maybe you find some way to redeem yourself. The purpose of the judge is to find some way to mete out a justice that doesn't merely perpetuate the cycles of wrong. And that's what this whole trilogy is about. And central to this is the concept that the current generation of deities, the Olympians, have saved us from the Titans. The Titans were awful, right? Cronus devouring his children to prevent any of them from growing great enough to supplant him. And have you seen that? Is it Goya that does the hideous painting of Cronus devouring his children? And he's got this, horrible white eyes and wide mouth, and he's dropping a corpse into his mouth. This is how the Greeks felt about the previous religion, the Titan religion. They're terrified of it. And yet it too was better from their perspective than the even darker, more horrible thing of the past. So here again, we come back to that recurring theme. Can you have a culture or an epic that doesn't include a recapitulation of the terrible blunders and catastrophes of the past and how you learn to stop doing that and to behave better? This is what the Agamemnon, in fact, the whole Oresteia is about. the old justice being replaced by the new justice, and Zeus overseeing this as a savior who saves us from the traps that we were caught in. And of course, where this wraps up and brings us full home is this idea that to the medievals, all of these classical gods are just daimons or demons. And our sinful character is also just a demon that possesses us. And Jesus is a savior because he's going to save us from our own character, our own sinful nature. He's going to save us from those old gods who didn't help us to be good people. And he's going to save us from our own rotten character. He's going to drive out, he's going to be an exorcist who drives out the demons. And in that space that's opened up, that dilates within our soul, that creates space for us to be possessed instead by the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is not a demon, it's really God. And it brings goodness and truth and justice into us in a way that's never possible so long as we're possessed by our own character, our ethos, our daimon. And this is part of the Hellenic context in which Paul is writing, even though moderns can't see it. We aren't Hellenic, we aren't Hellenes. We don't understand the way that he's thinking. But why in Paul and especially in the Gospels, are we seeing Jesus and his followers driving out demons? This is the salvation to free you from your ethos. Your sick nature will not rule you anymore. And instead, you'll get good with God, and God can't be corrupted. And so now we can finally create an incorruptible human civilization on Earth. This is the medieval promise. And this is how it builds off of these older ideas. So in some ways, even though it's a revolution against the ancient worldview had already incorporated the concept of revolutions in values, in gods, in justice, succession after succession of improvements. So what Paul is saying is that Jesus is just the latest in a long line of saviors. He's the new savior. This is the foundation for the medieval worldview. He finishes up chapter 4 as follows. Let's see here. Yes. So unknown and unpredictable was God and his unfathomable will, that Judaism indeed has known better than to produce, in a strict sense, a theology, a putative, rational, systematic, or scientific knowledge of God. Judaism ascribes to an open-ended fealty, a liability of obedience unto God's obscure will, which may even require one to sacrifice his utmost welfare. Christianity, by contrast, and he's especially talking here about medieval Christianity. Medieval Christianity, by contrast, grasps its God in faith, a certainty that God is looking out for the welfare of his flock. And the subtext of what Kenneth is saying here is that where the Jews tread lightly when it comes to claiming to know the limits of what God can or can't do and will or will not demand of us, the medieval Christian says, I know God is all good. And I know he's going to do what's best for us. He wants Christianity to win. He wants Christianity to beat Judaism. He wants it to beat Islam, beat all the heretics, and we're going to spread this good, perfect religion all over the world. And in doing that, there's an act of hubris, is what Kenneth is saying. That is missing from classical Judaism. Classical Judaism is cautious about claiming to know what God wants from us. But Christianity says, we know God's mind. We know God's will. He continues, Judaism emphasizes the spiritual athleticism or inward virtuosity of those who believe, their aptness to unknown tasks. But medieval Christianity has naively redefined the purpose of God as covertly to serve the human good, to take care of his faithful as a shepherd his sheep. Right? And we see this in the difference between, rabbinical students in debates arguing about what God might mean here and exploring all the possibilities on the one hand, and Jacob wrestling an angel as a symbol of all of that, right? Versus on the other hand, the modern fundamentalist Bible group, which is carefully going a sentence at a time, making sure that everybody memorizes the correct interpretation and that they can recapitulate it to the satisfaction of the Sunday school teacher. You have to say it the way that I interpret it. I'm willing to say that there might be some mystery here, but if you say anything I don't really like, I'm not going to say, good for you. What an excellent rabbinical student you are. You should fight with me and argue with me. This is good. Let's do this. He's gonna, all of a sudden the friendliness and kindness ebbs. And if he becomes a problem, you might have to meet with the pastor and he might get kicked out of the church. You have to stay within the lines. It's a completely different approach to biblical study. And I'm not saying this is how all Christians study this stuff, but we're talking about the medieval approach to Christianity, in which there is one true answer and 1,000 wrong answers. And all the 1,000 wrong have to be collected up like wayward sheep and brought back into the fold, or they have to be killed, one or the other. He wraps up paragraph 4. It's one of his longer ones. So much medieval Christian prayer is naively boastful rhetoric, pride in having God on one's side in war, politics, sectarian conflict, even sports. And so little effort is made to ensure that humans know how to get on God's side. That would require a contemplative, philosophical culture, not simply arrogant and self-serving faith, a cultivated naivete. And it's one of the things that always bothered me when you see sports teams where someone says, we won because God was on our side. We prayed to God and God heard our prayers, and that's why we won today. And what I'm always thinking is, are you saying the other side didn't pray? That they don't care about God? That God loves you more than them? I mean, when you're thanking God for letting you win at a sports game, the hell are you saying about the other guy? It is a weirdly self-involved, I find it suffocatingly self-focused to say, God wanted me to win, not you. It's bizarre. And it's as Stephen says, effectively, Kenneth's critique here is that this medieval approach is putting God in a box. And if you think about it, if your goal is to take up the reins of the failing Roman Empire, which is a secular empire, essentially, and to convert it into a religious genocidal empire, whose purpose is to spread your version of the religion across the entire world and eliminate all others. And your justification for doing this is that God is all good and all knowing and all powerful, and that therefore the only way to create, but humans are corruptible and nature is corruptible. And therefore the only way to make a non-corruptible government on earth is to make a government that serves God. If that's your premise, which is the premise of the medieval epoch, then you have to put God in a box. You have to. You have to say, he's knowable by us. We know what he wants. So when we tell you to go kill your neighbor, you have to do it because I'm speaking for God. I'm not Henry VIII who just wants to get a lot of nookie and divorce his current wife to go get another one. No, right? I'm speaking for God. God wants us to be able to break up our marriages. Right? You have to, all of this is based on claiming that you know what God wants and that what God wants happens to be what you want. What a coincidence. And not what the other guy wants. What a shame. There is Stephen's right. Kierkegaard savages this version of Christianity a few centuries later when he writes his attack on Christendom. He's like, this is everything that's wrong with Christianity as a failure to follow Jesus's teachings and instead becoming a convenience, a way in which we feel good about ourselves and justify the terrible things we want to do in the world. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I will say something about sports teams. As an old guy of limited talent, I played for many church teams. Not because I could play, I could make the team. That's why I played for them. I wanted to keep playing. I wanted to play in real gyms and have refs and stuff like that. And of course, it being church on church, there was always a prayer at center court before. And I will say that contrary to maybe my initial expectations, there was never a prayer for victory. The prayer always was that it was a clean game and no one got hurt. I think at least some people within Christianity realize that you don't get to command God to be on your side. Now, I never tried to grade these churches I played for. I like their gyms, you know, and I guess it's a I don't know if I did it in bad faith. If they said you have to go to church 3 times a month in order to be on the team, well, great. I played twice a week. Hey, I got eight games, you know, or something. So I don't know. So there is that. And famously, one of the more famous things is in the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. Because somebody said to him at one time, gosh, I sure hope that God's on our side. And Lincoln famously responded, let us hope that we're on his. You know,
Yes.
so
that sentence right there in that paragraph is almost certainly Ken making a reference to the famous Lincoln quote.
yeah,
Almost
I mean
certainly.
maybe that reformed the American church. I don't know. The other thing I'd like to bring in is that in this difference between Christian and Judaic views of God is that it's kind of a stereotype, but the Jew they negotiate with God, they haggle, something that never occurs in Christianity. You know, it's always clear and one way, whereas, well, what are our obligations here? Well, let's discuss it. You know, doesn't come up. I mean, it doesn't come up in Christianity, but the interplay among the rabbis in interpreting the text mimics the negotiations. I mean, they have a covenant. It's a contract. It's a negotiated contract. It's like a labor agreement or something. I don't. But it's not Christian. It's profoundly not Christian. But it leads one to, yes, we know God's mind in this case because we've got an agreement with him. But you want to know what God's mind is for that case? Well, you'd better get talking to him because you got some negotiating to do. Well, enough of that.
Oh, that's good.
Except for, and Carthage must be destroyed.
It's going to be a recurring theme. So, yeah, I mean, what you're saying.
Who is it? I'm sure Stephen would. Is it?
Carthago delenda est?
Yeah. Yeah, that the famous Roman that ended every speech
Yes.
that he ever made.
Yes. Got to get those guys. Yeah.
It's always pertinent. You know,
Yeah.
you can introduce that topic at any point.
It's like read my lips, no new taxes for those of us who lived through the first Bush administration. There's no speech on any topic that I can't work that in. It's going to be my hammer. I'm just going to hammer that theme over and over. So the point I want to make is underscoring the contrast that Donald just made, which is even though the religious empire of the medieval epoch had this take on God and their command over God. They would never say it as we have command over God, but de facto, none of the things they're saying make sense unless they believe that they have command over God, that they know what God wants, and God can't change his mind, and you have to do what they say, or else God won't like you. But we don't even know if that's the majority view. The majority of Christians in Europe during the medieval epoch, it's like we said earlier, they might just have gone along with that because it was too hard to fight it. And we know that there is just sort of an endless river of heretics for the entire 1,000-year period of this kind of pro-genocide medieval thing. There are all these people who are constantly suggesting otherwise. And some of their ideas are original to them. Some of them date back to before the orthodoxy has been established. They're old threads of Christianity that got seemingly snuffed out in terms of holding power, but it turns out maybe not snuffed out in terms of oral tradition because they keep popping up again over and over. Some of it's inspired by Judaism, contact with Jewish traditions. Some of it's inspired by contact with Islam, Muslim traditions. But whatever the case, what all of these things have in common is that these guys don't think they have as clear a grasp on God as the power structure thinks it has. And they're open to the idea of a God who's infinite, who's greater than their ability to characterize him. And that they want to approach these topics with keen interest and a willingness to explore ideas and humility about their own command of the subject. And this is being suppressed for 1,000 years when they're if they can at least keep them from holding power and force them out into little separate monastic traditions. But at worst, they kill these people if they catch them, if they seem to be in any kind of influential position of power. That's what happened to the Albigensians. They turned a crusade on southern France. Said as long as we got an army here, let's stomp these guys out. So. But as with Ari's example of the case of, one rabbinical scholar gets missed and he's able to preserve an entire tradition. The same thing happens with the Reformation. We see with the Reformation, once it becomes clear from the example that it's possible to break free from the medieval church, everybody and his dog comes running out of seemingly nowhere. The woodwork spills forth with all these heretics who all set up their own Christian denominations. And you have to think that what you're seeing here is the survival of these very old oral traditions that learn to keep their mouths shut for 1,000 years. There are occasional rumblings, but then they quickly get quiet again to avoid being persecuted. But the moment they have a chance to flower again, it's like those seeds that come out of the earth. And you're like, Jesus, there hasn't been one of those things here in 70 years. But I guess the seed decided the time was right. We have trillium growing in our backyard underneath the vine maple. The vine maple was dropping its leaves for 15 years, and then abruptly these trillium seeds started erupting from the soil and bringing up these plants that hadn't been seen in a century, maybe. I mean, just forever. But the trillium remembers that this used to be a rainforest, even though it's all houses and backyards now. And so when there's one little spot where the soil conditions become right from enough of a native plant dropping its leaves and then rotting and making the soil right, the trillium seed says, my time has come. I emerge from the soil and reestablish my tradition. And now they've got a whole bunch of them back there. After a 70-year absence, it's amazing. This is what happens. So I don't want to. I'm basically offering a correction to Kenneth's text that is not, I think, a correction to Kenneth's intent. It's just, he had more time to write otherwise than he did to write these installments of Millennia and Microcosm. And sometimes he uses almost the right word. So he often says Christian and not medieval Christian. And there really isn't a right word to be precise. You can't be saying over and over again, the theology promulgated by the power structure of medieval Europe, which is genocidal and claims to know God better than any person should ever claim to know God. It's just too awkward in English to narrow down the scope of what he's trying to say to be precise about who he's criticizing here. But that's who he's criticizing. And we know that because well, you put together what he says in the other chapters, and you put together what he's written elsewhere, and also what he's just said in classes and conversations. We know that's his intent. He's not saying that no Christian has ever thought otherwise. On the contrary, he knows many Christians have thought otherwise from this tradition. But right now, he's just trying to characterize the center. And that's why in the year that comes, I want to supplement what he wrote here with excerpts from other free thinkers, because I know that if Kenneth had more time to come back and revisit this, he would add that second thread of the dialectic in here. It's important to him. All right, well, so that's one of the things I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say, and Kenneth does love irony, is the Greek inability to stop fighting each other, which the Greeks criticized relentlessly, and the Macedonians criticized relentlessly, and the Romans criticized relentlessly. They just couldn't stop fighting. And as Nietzsche says, they desperately tried to solve the problem by converting conflict into contest with the Olympic Games and the Nemean Games and the Isthmian Games and the other one that I always forget. They recognized they had a serious problem that could destroy them, and they tried to stop it, and they couldn't stop it. And in the end, with the Peloponnesian War, they take them, and the successor wars, they take themselves down until even backwater Macedonia is able to come in and mop them up and take over. That's how low they'd sunk. And then the Romans claim to have solved the problem. They say the problem is each of you is fighting for your polis, and each of you comes from a different polis, and that means you all have to fight each other. Rome is going to solve this problem. We're going to have one polis, and it's Rome. Rome is the only city, and the whole empire will be one giant city-state with Rome as the polis. And they say, that solved it. We fixed the problem. Now we're not going to have the problem you have. And yet, how long does it take the Roman emperors to start, stabbing each other in the back and replacing each other, and the military to get it fed up with the emperors and depose one and put in another? What was the year? I can't remember how many emperors there were in a single year before the Flavian emperors. It was at least 4. I think it was the year of the 4 emperors. Just bam, bam, bam. They dissolve into the same kind of problem. They have a problem that they think they've solved, but really they haven't been able to solve it. And we see the same thing with the early Christians. The early Christian sects are all fighting with each other over who's the real Christian. Which of our strands is the real Christianity? The strand that wins in the end, the dominant medieval Christianity, is going to rewrite its own history to claim that it was always there, and it was original, and that Christians used to be united. And then there were splitters who split off with heresies, and it was the job of the Orthodox to pull back the splits and re-heal the church. And it's all lies. We know it's not true. Christianity comes out the gate with like 12 different variations. I mean, it takes no time at all before there's wild variations. And the thing that becomes the Orthodox position that runs the medieval Europe, for 1,000 years, through that period, they evolved gradually over time. Then we're still establishing basic facts about, fundamental items in their theology in the 200s and the 300s and the 400s. And they have popes making declarations to stop arguing about some of this stuff because they still haven't settled it. So they can say after the fact that this was always what Christianity was, but the truth was not that at all. They were like the Greeks and like the Romans. They were a bunch of infighting squabblers, very much like Monty Python shows and Monty Python and the Life of Brian. All these different groups that are trying to kick out the Romans, spending more time fighting each other than they do fighting the Romans. This is how the early Christians were. I'm not saying that's all that was going on, but there were enormous disagreements over theology. And if you go to seminary school, what you're going to learn about is what were they fighting about? And the answer was everything. There isn't a single point of Christian theology that there wasn't a serious knockdown, drag out fight over during those first 3-4 centuries. It all had to be squabbled over. So interestingly, anathema. Yeah, that's a good one. Muhammad was originally aiming to become a Christian. But the more he looked at the Christians, the more he saw they just can't stop fighting each other. All they do is squabble with each other over who's the real Christian and who's wrong. And that was ultimately why he went his own way and created Islam. It's because the Christians couldn't stop quarreling with each other. It wasn't what he wanted to do. And it's why in Islam, it is a major point of theology that you have to respect the Jews and the Christians, because they are also people of the book, even if they can't stop fighting with each other, even if they can't figure out what they stand for, we can see that their heart is in the right place. And it's why when Islam takes over Spain, there are Jews and Christians living in Moorish Spain, and they have to pay a little extra taxes, but that's it. Otherwise, they're not persecuted. It's not until Isabella helps to reconquer, Spain from the infidels to purify her nation, that then it becomes hell on earth to be Jewish in Spain, or to be Muslim. They're just the Christians. The medieval Christians are 100% intolerant of the Jews and the Muslims in the land they've taken over, and they set about trying to engage in genocide, which is, after all, 1,000 years of practice in Europe. That's what they're about. The second they get in control, it's genocide time again. Jews in Moorish Spain was a golden age of scholarship and art and theology and medicine, but Jews under the Reconquista, under Isabella, is hell on earth. It's horrible. It's a foreshadowing of the Nazi Holocaust. We're seeing in these issues of, and this goes to Stephen's point about genocide. Is there something in us that makes us so vulnerable to squabbling over anything and everything? And what does it take to get us to settle down and create a brotherhood of man, which is supposed to be what the medieval project was about? All of this is the stuff at stake in what Kenneth is saying here. He's trying to point out, where are we falling short and why are we falling short? So we got 10 minutes left. I'm going to use that 10 minutes to get us into paragraph 5, because we started paragraph 4 last week, but now we're done with it. Let's move on. He says, Christianity did not abstain from the intellectual temptation of snaring the essence of God in a theology, however. But like Judaism, its God remained concretely uncharted territory, totally unlike the gods of the Greeks. Right? And this is to echo back to what we were saying last week. The Greeks believed that even though the sacred, the divine gods, daimons, are a different order of life than we are, than a human being is, they also believed that gods and mortals are both part of nature and subject to the laws of nature. It's one of the ways that the ancient religion is the opposite of the medieval religion. And so in that sense, it meant that every Greek god had a character, an ethos. And in the same way that an ethos of a human being is binding upon them, so binding that your character is your fate. Likewise, the character of the Olympian gods was binding upon them. Their characters were their fates. And having a character means you have a nature. You act in certain patterns. Those patterns are observable by others, and you can be knowable. The ancient Olympian gods were knowable gods in exactly the way the medieval god is not. Right? The early medieval theologians are trying to one-up the classical scholars and philosophers and theologians, and they're saying your gods don't even count as gods because they're subject to nature. Our God is immune to nature. He's above nature. He's before nature. He created nature and he could have made it any way he wants to, and tomorrow he could make it completely different than it was yesterday. So you don't know anything. He's unknowable. You don't get to say what he's like. He's undefinable. He is, the favorite word, ineffable. And so are his plans. So this is the contrast that Kenneth is making here. He continues, the monotheist religions were left with no plurality of gods, among whom divinity might act and discharge its latent nature or character before peers who could appreciate those acts. He's saying that when Poseidon acts, Zeus and Hades can sit back and critique him. As gods, as his peers, they can critique Poseidon's behavior. Right? Because they're on the same scale he is. But in a monotheist religion, there's only the one God, and we have no business telling him what to do because we're just petty, puny mortals who, were it not for the gift of grace, would be meaningless. So we're supposed to shut up and do what he says, according to the medieval theology. He's ironically also saying it's sort of a lonely place for the medieval God to be. And I know that he's saying that in part because he wrote a parable about that in Otherwise, in which Jesus has a conversation with Prometheus, who's still bound to the mountain where Zeus has the eagle tearing out Prometheus's liver. And Prometheus and Jesus commiserate with one another about what it's like to be in the God business. It's really, really quite touching and wholly blasphemous from a medieval perspective. The singular God keeps his own counsel, has no peers, and how he treats the historical world of men is in ways so obscure as to leave his meaning generally dubious. Hermeneutics, that branch of theology that seeks to make sense of God's patterns of purpose via his actions, tries to interpret these matters of the infinite in humanly reasonable terms. So there's paragraph 5. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I mean, it's mine is like just more of a question and clarification. I mean, when I think of transcendence, I think of in terms of wisdom and meaning, and that the meaning that's created is, what is worth living for, and that allows you to transcend your desires, your immediate desires, and drive it towards something bigger than yourself, where the outcome isn't so clear, but you're doing the best you can. But then there's obviously the transcendence is different, obviously, in the religious context. So how does Kenneth view transcendence is really kind of my question, is that because it's an important part of this conversation. It's one of those things that everybody can do it, right? No matter what your metaphysics are. But it's a question of his viewpoint on that.
Yes. So he would contrast what meaning is to the Greeks with what meaning is to the medievals on this question of transcendence. And he'd say the reason that we associate good things with transcendence is because we're basically a successor to the medievals. And for the medievals, transcendence was everything. They needed their God to transcend nature, to make him all powerful, to not be bound by the laws of nature. And therefore, meaning comes through transcendence in a medieval perspective. But from an ancient perspective, that's not true at all. From the ancient perspective, nothing transcends nature. Meaning, instead of being transcendent, meaning is immanent. It is in the structure of nature that it has this meaning. In fact, it wouldn't be nature without this meaning. So the Greeks would say that the oak does not transcend the acorn. It fulfills the acorn. It is the expression of the acorn's own character, given time and opportunity to express itself. So there's no transcendence at work. And this is what Hegel says with the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He's saying this is a non-transcendental relationship of meaning in which the meaning that was always present but hidden within the character of the earliest form, it has time to unfold itself, and new order emerges from inside of itself. And that's a fulfillment of its character rather than a transcendence of its character. And that this is what the Greek gods were. They were the fulfillment of the laws of nature, not a violation of the laws of nature. And that their meaning is merely expressing the meaning that's already in nature. And Kenneth, as an existentialist, is sympathetic to this ancient perspective. He's critical of the medieval perspective on this. And I'm not going to say that's the sum total of where he comes down, but that's certainly his starting place.
Yeah, no, and I mean that. Thank you for that, because this is a kind of an important area, because in this is found purpose, right? The way you were just talking about it and described it. And this is the do what is it? Like essentially do whatever it is that you do well. This is a reason to do it.
Yes.
Well, because you start to see yourself as part of nature, part of something bigger than yourself, and you see a role. So that's like a knife that cuts, well. It does what it's supposed to do. So that would be one of those examples of that. And no, I appreciate the idea as character as fate as well. I mean, that's essential. If you start to the world that you create is based off of your character.
Yes.
I mean, that's it. That's how you respond to the world. So, it comes back to that agency and contingency part, but it's the idea you're in the situation. How are you now going to respond?
Exactly.
And that will determine the world you create.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you can respond with, anger or an indifference, or, a charitable viewpoint, and that will shape your worldview.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
That's what CBT is.
Yes.
Minus, it needs more ethics, but that's still okay. Reframing.
Yes, reframing. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, refer to something which might be in the general thing. I've noticed over the years in the debates of the atheists, and understand I have spiritual beliefs, but they're not necessarily the Christian religion or anything like that. It's just I have a belief in spirit. Anyway, my arguments with the atheists over the years, I've noticed their main theme seems to be that when we finally erase religion, genocide religion, or an all religious thought, and then we'll be living in paradise, the final triumph of reason. Because once we've gotten rid of all the bad stuff, there'll be only the dictatorship of reason. Now, I think I asked last week, that was my ending question, was, is religion disappearing because of the rise of reason and the Enlightenment, or is it something else? With the peculiar event that, of course, once they got rid of one religion, they're creating climate cults, for example, and other types of cults, weirdly. So it looks like the human creature just has to have a cult of some variety. I mean, when they got rid of God, as Nietzsche said, well, the state became God. Therefore, you obey the orders of the state. It's the absolute. It's not the case in the 19th century when you still had a God. And the state said, exterminate all these people. And the guy said, oh, but the Christian faith says something else. They had another judge. But once the state became God, that was the ultimate. And for Hegel as well. That was the absolute state. He gifted us with something really wonderful. But that's it. The atheist plan is to erase religion, and we'll be in paradise. When we clean the slate of everything is there, then our perfect world will have room to grow.
This
Thank
is, it's an excellent point, Stephen, and it's one of the great ironies that most atheists would not appreciate, although a few do, which is that in the quest to eliminate all religions, that particular brand of atheist is behaving as a medieval. The medievals were incredibly devoted to their one God, but absolutely antagonistic to all the others. If you imagine thousands upon thousands of gods respected on the earth, the medieval position can be summarized as atheists are almost right. They're only off by one. And we need to exterminate all those other religions. And then we'll be down to the one that's correct. And the atheist says, yes, you're almost right. You're only off by one. We need to exterminate all of the religions. And then he's not willing to acknowledge that he's standing up reason as a god. So he's a kind of medieval who's confused about what he's doing and thinks that he's the opposite of the medieval while actually being almost identical to the medieval, just off by one important detail. It's I'm the 20-something me would have been horrified by this observation, but I come by it honestly, and it goes in line with what you're saying, Stephen. There is an enormous amount when people try to adhere to pure reason and worship it as a source of only goodness and no badness. They're really confused about what reason is and is not, because reason is no guarantee of goodness. Just like a logical syllogism is, if it's valid, that's no guarantee of truth. Right? I mean, 99 out of 100 perfectly valid logical syllogisms are false because they started with the wrong premises. You can logically conclude anything if you start with the right premises.
Well, if the posit is the Jews are bad, what's the reasonable outcome?
Right, exactly.
Well, my word is, it's a conundrum.
It's a conundrum. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to give Phineas the last word for today because we're wrapping up. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just love the point from the beginning about how fish can't see water; they have no concept of water. And then, so what's our water like? What are we not seeing just because we're totally submersed in it? I just really like that point. So I wanted to bring that back.
Thank you, Phineas. I like it too. I think it's almost, I can't say for sure, but if it's not the very best thing that Kenneth talks about, it's somewhere in the top 2 or 3. That idea that we're missing some things and the things we're missing are incredibly important.
Yeah, I can almost feel it, but of course I don't know what it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's like now that I've thought about it, I feel like something's pressing on me, but what is it? I can't quite work it out. Anyway, that's what he's up to in this book. I hope you all had a good time. I had a fabulous time. And I'll see you all next
Thank you,
week.
Rick. That was wonderful discussion today. Unusually so, I think.
Hey, Rick,
Yeah, Donald.
continuing your argument, I read something at one time that Marx and Lenin were Christians too.
Yes.
They had the same faith in heaven and purification and God's will that any Christian did.
Yes. Just swap out a few little pieces, and otherwise it's the same game. Yes. Yes. Very, very disturbing.
It's kind of like what I think Stephen posted a comment last week about Christians and atheists continuing in the same vein.
Yes, I like that.
I did.
That's Nietzsche. The atheists are continuing in the same vein as the ones they oppose. They've retained the essence of Christianity. They're just thrown out the meat. They've got a Christianity light, I think is the term they use.
Well,
and Nietzsche's saying that no, in the long run, you won't be able to retain the values of Christianity without the belief in the God.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
his critiques of modernity are incredible.
Thank you for posting that last week, Stephen.
Much appreciated.
You have to read The Madman.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on that note, have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.